The forest was eerily quiet, as if all living beings had suddenly disappeared. But then a muffled sound of heavy footsteps filled the air, and an immense form emerged from the shadows, its size and presence imposing a primal fear in me. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because, as I stepped onto the trail, the crisp Oregon air filled my lungs, blissfully unaware of the terror that awaited me. The Cascade Mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks barely visible through the dense canopy of Douglas firs and western red cedars. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the familiar weight of my camping gear settle comfortably against my spine. This solo hiking trip was long overdue, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature after months of grueling work in Portland's bustling tech scene. "You've got this, Jacob," I muttered to myself, taking a deep breath and savoring the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. The trailhead sign read, Willamette National Forest, Opal Creek Wilderness, and I couldn't help but smile at the promise of adventure that lay ahead. The first mile was easygoing, the well-maintained trail winding through towering old-growth forest. Shafts of golden sunlight pierced the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. I paused occasionally to snap photos with my smartphone, capturing the vibrant green moss that cloaked fallen logs and the delicate wildflowers that dotted the undergrowth. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the melodic calls of unseen birds. The tranquility was intoxicating, washing away the stress and worries I'd carried with me from the city. Around midday, I came across a small clearing next to a babbling brook. It seemed like the perfect spot for a lunch break. I shrugged off my backpack and pulled out a protein bar and my water bottle. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, munching on my meager meal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Get a grip, Miller," I chuckled nervously, scanning the tree line. It's probably just a curious deer or something. But the uneasy feeling persisted, prickling at the back of my neck. I finished my lunch quickly and set off again, eager to put some distance between myself and the clearing. The afternoon wore on, and the trail began to climb steadily. My calves burned with the effort, but I welcomed the physical challenge. It was a reminder of why I loved hiking so much, the satisfaction of pushing my body to its limits, knowing that each step brought me closer to some hidden natural wonder. As if on cue, I rounded a bend and found myself face to face with a breathtaking sight. A picturesque waterfall cascaded down a series of moss-covered rocks, its spray creating a shimmering rainbow in the late afternoon light. I stood there, awestruck, not realizing it would be the last moment of serenity I'd experience. "Wow," I whispered, fumbling for my phone to capture the scene. As I framed the shot, a movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I lowered the phone, squinting at the dense foliage on the other side of the falls. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something large and dark moving between the trees. The snap of a twig in the distance made me turn, but I dismissed it as wildlife, a fatal mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Still, an inexplicable sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. "It's getting late," I muttered, checking my watch. "Better find a good spot to set up camp." I hiked on for another hour, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each passing minute. The cheerful bird song of earlier had given way to the eerie hoots of owls and the rustling of nocturnal creatures stirring in the underbrush. Finally, I came across a small clearing that seemed suitable for camping. It was sheltered on three sides by thick stands of trees, with a small rocky outcropping providing some additional protection from the wind. I set about pitching my tent with practiced efficiency, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at the pit of my stomach. As I hammered the last tent stake into the ground, a cool breeze whispered through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, musky odor that made my nose wrinkle. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled before, a pungent mix of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't quite place. Probably just a skunk or something, I reasoned, but the explanation felt hollow, even as I said it aloud. With the tent secure, I set about gathering firewood. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and twigs, making the task relatively easy. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and heated up a pouch of dehydrated camping food. As I ate my unappetizing meal, the flames cast flickering shadows across the clearing. The dancing light seemed to bring the surrounding forest to life, creating the illusion of movement just beyond the fire's glow. "Get it together, Jacob," I chided myself, trying to shake off the growing paranoia. "You've camped alone dozens of times. This is no different." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something felt off about this forest, this night. The very air seemed charged with an otherworldly energy that set my nerves on edge. As the fire died down to glowing embers, I reluctantly prepared for bed. The thought of being confined in the small tent, vulnerable and alone in the vast wilderness, made my heart race. But exhaustion from the day's hike eventually won out over fear, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. Massive, shadowy figures lurked just out of sight, their heavy breathing seeming to come from all around me. I tossed and turned, tangling myself in the sleeping bag as I tried to escape the nightmarish visions. A blood-curdling howl pierced the night, jolting me awake with a strangled gasp. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining my ears to catch any sound beyond the thundering of my own pulse. The howl had been unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite wolf, not quite bear, but something altogether more primal and terrifying. "It's just a dream," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just a dream." But as the last echoes of the howl faded away, replaced by an eerie, expectant silence, I knew with chilling certainty that this was no dream. Something was out there in the darkness, something that defied explanation or reason. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As I unzipped the tent flap, a gust of wind carried that same musky odor I'd noticed earlier. Only now it was stronger, more oppressive. It filled my nostrils and seemed to cling to the back of my throat, making me gag. With trembling fingers, I pulled back the tent flap and shone the flashlight out into the clearing. The beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing nothing but shadows and swaying branches. But as I swept the light across the ground, my blood ran cold. There, not 10 feet from my tent, was a set of footprints that hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own feet, with distinct toe impressions and a depth that spoke of incredible weight. Whatever had made those prints was no ordinary forest creature. As the implications of what I was seeing sank in, another howl split the night air, closer this time. Much closer. The sound reverberated through my body, filling me with a primal terror I'd never experienced before. I scrambled back into the tent, zipping it closed as if the thin nylon fabric could offer any protection against the monster that lurked in the forest. As I huddled in my sleeping bag, ears straining for any sound of approach, one thought echoed through my mind. This was only the beginning of my nightmare. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound of movement outside the tent. The howl that had awakened me still echoed in my mind, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was primal, terrifying, and unmistakably close. "It's just a wolf," I whispered to myself, trying to calm my racing heart. "Or maybe a cougar. Nothing to worry about." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. Whatever had made that sound was no ordinary predator. The massive footprints I'd seen outside my tent were proof of that. As the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, the forest around me fell into an unnatural silence. No rustling leaves, no night birds calling, not even the sound of insects. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, before exhaustion finally overcame me. When I next opened my eyes, weak morning light was filtering through the tent fabric. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that the events of the night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. That hope was shattered the instant I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing around my campsite looked like a war zone. My carefully stacked firewood was scattered everywhere, and deep gouges marred the trunks of nearby trees. But it was the footprints that made my blood run cold. Massive impressions in the soft earth, easily twice the size of my own feet, circled the tent. They hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep. "This can't be happening," I muttered, my voice shaking. "This isn't real." But the evidence before my eyes was undeniable. Something huge had been prowling around my tent while I slept, something that defied explanation. I approached one of the clearer footprints, my scientific curiosity momentarily overriding my fear. The impression was deep, with distinct toe marks and a shape that was disturbingly human-like, yet far too large. As I crouched down for a closer look, a pungent, musky odor assaulted my nostrils, making me gag and filling me with inexplicable dread. It was the same smell I'd noticed the night before, only stronger now. It clung to the air around the footprints, a mixture of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. Something alien and wrong. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, intending to photograph the prints. But to my dismay, the screen remained black. The battery, which had been nearly full the day before, was completely drained. No, I muttered, frantically pressing the power button. This can't be happening. Without photographic evidence, who would believe what I'd seen? Who would believe that something monstrous had stalked my campsite in the night? A twig snapped in the forest behind me, and I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows deepening despite the growing daylight. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly weak. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Unseen eyes bored into me from the surrounding forest, calculating, predatory. I knew then that I had to get out of there. Whatever was lurking in these woods, whatever had left those impossible footprints, I wanted no part of it. With shaking hands, I began to break down my camp, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. As I worked, a plan began to form in my mind. I'd hike back to the trailhead as quickly as possible, then drive to the nearest ranger station. Surely they would believe me. Surely they'd seen something like this before. But even as I thought it, doubt gnawed at me. Who in their right mind would believe a story about giant humanoid footprints and blood-curdling howls in the night? I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost missed it, a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I slowly turned to look. For a split second I saw it. A massive, hair-covered figure, easily 8 feet tall, standing just within the tree line. Its body was powerfully built, covered in thick matted fur. But it was the eyes that haunted me. Intelligent, predatory, and filled with an alien malevolence that chilled me to my core. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest with impossible speed and silence for something so large. "Oh God," I whispered, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." Panic overtook me then. I abandoned any pretense of packing neatly, shoving my gear haphazardly into my backpack. Tent stakes were left behind, my water filter forgotten. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my compass, trying to orient myself towards the trailhead. But to my horror, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any one direction. "This isn't happening," I muttered, shaking the compass violently. "This can't be happening." But it was happening. Something about this place, about that creature, seemed to defy the laws of nature. My phone was dead, my compass useless. I was alone in the wilderness, being stalked by a monster straight out of a nightmare. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees, raising the hair on the back of my neck. It was closer now, much closer than before. Whatever was out there, it was toying with me, hurting me like prey. I ran. Abandoning the trail, I plunged into the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me onward. Behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls and the snapping of branches under immense weight. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that mad dash through the wilderness. But eventually, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling to the forest floor. I lay there, gasping for breath, waiting for the killing blow to fall. But it never came. Slowly, I raised my head, looking around with wild eyes. The forest was silent once more, no sign of my pursuer. Had I imagined it all? As I struggled to my feet, wincing at the scrapes and bruises from my fall, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Massive footprints in the mud near where I'd fallen, still fresh. Whatever had been chasing me had been mere feet away when I'd tripped. Why hadn't it attacked? Why let me live? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was still playing with me. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a game, and I was nothing more than a helpless pawn. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in deep shadows, I knew I had to find shelter. The thought of spending another night in these woods, exposed and vulnerable, was unbearable. But I had no choice. I was lost, my gear scattered who knows where in my panicked flight. With shaking hands, I began to gather what materials I could to build a makeshift shelter. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those inhuman eyes were following my every move. As darkness fell, I huddled in my pitiful lean-to, jumping at every sound. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, playing tricks on my terrified mind. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this was only the beginning. Whatever stalked these woods wasn't done with me yet. And as the night deepened, bringing with it the promise of fresh horrors, I wondered if I would live to see the dawn. The night seemed endless. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I huddled in my makeshift shelter, exhausted but too terrified to sleep. The forest around me pulsed with an otherworldly energy, as if the very air was alive with malevolent intent. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all. The stress of being lost in the wilderness, combined with exhaustion, could explain the footprints, the sounds, even the glimpse of that creature. But as I crawled out of my shelter, my body stiff and aching from the night spent on the hard ground, that hope was quickly extinguished. There, not 10 feet from where I had slept, was a fresh set of those massive, inhuman footprints. Whatever was stalking me had been close. Too close. "This isn't happening," I muttered, running my hands through my hair. "This can't be real." But the evidence before my eyes was undeniable. The footprints were deep, the edges crisp and clear in the soft earth. Whatever had made them was incredibly heavy and had passed by recently. I knew I had to move. Staying in one place wasn't an option anymore. With shaking hands, I gathered what little I had, a small knife, some paracord I'd had in my pocket, and a half-empty water bottle. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. As I started to move through the forest, I tried to orient myself. The sun was rising to my right, which meant I was heading north? Or was it south? As in my panic the day before, I had lost all sense of direction. For all I knew, I could be moving deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of rescue. The forest seemed different in the daylight. Shadows that had seemed menacing in the darkness now revealed themselves to be nothing more than ordinary trees and rocks. Birds chirped overhead, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. But I knew better now. I knew what was lurking in these woods. I had been walking for maybe an hour when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, but as I stood there, straining my ears for any sound, I became aware of a presence. Something was watching me. I could feel its gaze boring into me, predatory and calculating. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the trees around me. That's when I saw it. My heart stopped as a massive, hair-covered figure emerged from the darkness, its eyes gleaming with malice. It stood on two legs like a man, but there was nothing human about it. It was easily 8 feet tall, its body rippling with muscle beneath a coat of thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a heavy brow and a mouth full of yellowed teeth. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in them that chilled me to my core. Intelligence, awareness, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Then, without warning, it moved. The creature's roar shook the very ground beneath my feet, paralyzing me with fear. It was a sound of pure rage and aggression, unlike anything I had ever heard before. The force of it hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "Please, no." But my pleas fell on deaf ears. The monster charged towards me with inhuman speed, covering the distance between us in a heartbeat. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in roots as I tried desperately to escape. Its massive hand swatted me like a rag doll, sending me crashing into a tree with bone-crushing force. Pain exploded through my body as I collided with the unyielding trunk. I felt ribs crack, my vision blurring from the impact. I slumped to the ground, gasping for air. The world spun around me, trees and sky blending together in a nauseating swirl. Through the haze of pain and fear, I saw the creature approaching, its massive form blotting out the sun. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew there was no one to hear me. "Somebody help me!" The monster paused, cocking its head to the side as if curious about the sounds I was making. For a brief, insane moment, I thought maybe it could understand me. Maybe I could reason with it, plead for my life. But then I saw its eyes. There was no compassion there, no understanding, only a cold, alien intelligence and a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. It reached for me again, and I scrambled backwards, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs. My hand closed around a fallen branch, and without thinking, I swung it at the creature's face. To my surprise, the blow connected. The branch shattered against the monster's head, and it reared back with a roar of pain and rage. But my small victory was short-lived. If anything, my resistance only seemed to enrage it further. With a snarl that sent shivers down my spine, it lunged for me again. This time there was no escape. Its massive hand closed around my leg, and I felt bones snap under its grip. I screamed in agony as it lifted me effortlessly, dangling me upside down like a rag doll. The world spun crazily as the creature shook me, my head whipping back and forth. I felt something warm and wet on my face. Blood, I realized dimly. My own blood. Through the red haze of pain and terror, I saw the creature's face up close. Its breath was hot and fetid, reeking of decay. Saliva dripped from its bared teeth, and a low growl rumbled in its chest. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the Bigfoot's razor-sharp teeth, inches from my face. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end, that in a moment those teeth would close on my throat and my life would end here in this god-forsaken forest. But the killing blow never came. Instead, I felt myself being thrown. There was a moment of weightlessness, then impact. I bounced and rolled down a steep incline, every collision sending fresh waves of agony through my battered body. When I finally came to a stop, I lay there, broken and bleeding, waiting for death. But the forest around me was silent. No heavy footsteps, no monstrous roars, just the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Slowly, painfully, I opened my eyes. I was at the bottom of a ravine, surrounded by fallen logs and loose rocks. Above me, I could see the steep slope I had tumbled down. But of the creature, there was no sign. Had it lost interest in me? Or was this just another part of its sick game? As consciousness began to slip away, one thought echoed through my mind. This wasn't over. The monster was still out there. And I was trapped, injured and alone, in its hunting ground. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was the sound of heavy breathing somewhere in the forest above. Then, mercifully, everything went black. I awoke to searing pain as the beast's claws raked across my chest, tearing flesh and fabric alike. The world came into focus with brutal clarity, and I found myself face to face with the nightmare that had been stalking me. "No, God, no!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. The Bigfoot loomed over me, its massive form blocking out what little light filtered through the forest canopy. Its eyes, dark and filled with an alien intelligence, bore into mine. I could see my own terror reflected in those fathomless orbs. I tried to scramble away, but my body refused to cooperate. Every movement sent waves of agony through me, reminders of the injuries I'd sustained in my fall down the ravine. My ribs screamed in protest, and my left leg hung at an unnatural angle. The creature's hot, fetid breath washed over me as it leaned in closer. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth that seemed designed for tearing flesh. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its chest, vibrating the very air around us. "Please," I whimpered, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Please don't kill me." If the beast understood my words, it gave no sign. Instead, it reached out with one massive hair-covered hand. I flinched, expecting another blow, but instead it gripped the front of my tattered shirt. With a strength that defied belief, it lifted me effortlessly off the ground. My screams echoed through the forest as the movement sent fresh waves of agony through my battered body. I dangled there, feet kicking uselessly in the air, completely at the mercy of this impossible creature. "Help!" I cried out, though I knew there was no one to hear me. "Somebody help me!" The Bigfoot's response was a roar that shook the trees around us. The sound was deafening, filled with rage and something else. Hunger? The realization that this thing might not just kill me, but eat me, sent a fresh wave of terror through my system. My screams echoed through the forest as the creature lifted me effortlessly, squeezing the air from my lungs. I could feel my ribs creaking under the pressure, already weakened from my earlier injuries. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I struggled to breathe. Just when I thought I would pass out from lack of oxygen, the pressure suddenly released. For a brief moment, I felt weightless. Then reality came crashing back as the creature hurled me down the ravine. I bounced off rocks and fallen logs, each impact sending fresh waves of agony through my body. I could hear bones snapping, feel skin tearing. The world spun in a nauseating kaleidoscope of green and brown as I tumbled down the steep incline. When I finally came to a stop, I lay broken at the bottom, tasting blood and dirt. Every breath was agony, and I could feel warm wetness spreading across my chest, where the creature's claws had torn into me. Through swollen eyes, I watched in horror as the monster's heavy footsteps approached once more. It had followed me down the ravine, apparently not satisfied with the damage it had already inflicted. "Why?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" But there was no answer, no sign of comprehension in those alien eyes. This wasn't a misunderstood creature or a gentle giant. This was a predator, and I was its prey. As it loomed over me, I saw its muscles tense, preparing for what I was sure would be the final blow. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A distant rumble echoed through the forest, growing louder with each passing second. At first, I thought it was thunder, but as the sound intensified, I realized what it was: a rock slide. The Bigfoot's head snapped up, its attention drawn away from me. It let out a low, guttural sound that might have been confusion or alarm. Then chaos erupted. Boulders and smaller rocks came crashing down the ravine, an unstoppable force of nature. The creature let out a roar of frustration, and was that fear? It bounded away with surprising agility for something so large, disappearing into the forest. I lay there, paralyzed with pain and shock, as rocks tumbled past me. By some miracle, none of the larger boulders struck me directly, though I was pelted with smaller stones and debris. When the dust finally settled, I found myself partially buried in loose soil and gravel. The rock slide had reshaped the ravine, creating new obstacles, and potentially a barrier between me and the monster that had been intent on ending my life. With agonizing slowness, I began to dig myself out. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body, but fear drove me on. I knew I couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. As I worked to free myself, my hand brushed against something smooth and cool. Squinting through the grit and blood that clouded my vision, I realized it was a small crevice in the rock face, partially hidden by the debris from the rock slide. Hope surged through me. If I could squeeze into that crevice, maybe I could hide from the creature. It was a desperate plan, but it was all I had. Inch by excruciating inch, I dragged myself towards the opening. Each movement was agony, my broken body protesting every shift. But the memory of those savage claws, those inhuman eyes, spurred me on. Just as I reached the crevice, I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching once more. The creature had returned, undeterred by the rock slide. With a final desperate surge of energy, I pulled myself into the narrow opening. It was a tight fit, the rough stone scraping against my wounds, but I forced myself deeper into the crevice. I held my breath, ignoring the excruciating pain as the creature's massive hand groped blindly for me. I could see its claws, caked with dirt and what I feared was my own blood, searching the area where I had been lying just moments before. Hours passed like an eternity as I listened to the monster's frustrated grunts and sniffs just inches away. My entire world narrowed to the sound of its breathing, the occasional scrape of claws against stone. I don't know how long I stayed there, crammed into that tiny space, hovering on the edge of consciousness. Time lost all meaning. I drifted in and out, pain and terror keeping me from fully succumbing to the darkness that hovered at the edges of my vision. When silence finally fell, I dared to peek out, only to see two glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. A fresh wave of terror washed over me. It knew where I was. It was just waiting, biding its time. I retreated deeper into the crevice, praying for dawn and wondering if I'd live to see it. The night stretched on, an eternity of fear and pain. Every sound, every shadow, became the monster in my mind. As the first weak rays of sunlight began to filter into the ravine, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope. Had the creature given up? Had it moved on to easier prey? But as I shifted, preparing to peek out of my hiding place once more, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, just outside the crevice. It was still there, still waiting, and I was trapped, injured and alone, with no way to call for help, and no idea how long I could survive in this stone prison. As I huddled there, my body broken and my spirit nearly crushed, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This was far from over. The true horror was just beginning. The crevice had become my world, a narrow, suffocating prison of stone that paradoxically represented my only hope for survival. I lay there, my body broken and bleeding, listening to the heavy breathing of the monster that waited just outside. Every breath was agony. My ribs, almost certainly broken, protested with each shallow inhalation. The gashes on my chest from the creature's claws burned like fire, and I could feel the sticky warmth of blood slowly seeping through my tattered shirt. Time lost all meaning in that dark, cramped space. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was the other way around. The only constants were pain and fear, twin companions that never left my side. I don't know how long I had been there when I heard it, a rumbling in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. At first, I thought it was thunder, but as the sound intensified, I realized what it was. A rock slide, I whispered, my voice hoarse, and barely audible even to my own ears. The ground began to tremble beneath me, and I could hear the clatter of stones tumbling down the ravine. The beast outside let out a roar that was part frustration, part alarm. I heard its heavy footsteps retreating, moving away from my hiding place. By some miracle, a rock slide startled the beast, giving me a chance to crawl into a narrow crevice. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nature, which had seemed so hostile and unforgiving, had inadvertently come to my aid. As the rumbling subsided and silence fell once more, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the creature had been driven away for good. But I knew better than to leave my sanctuary. Not yet. Not when I was so vulnerable. I lay there straining my ears for any sound of the monster's return. Minutes ticked by, then an hour. The only sounds were the occasional patter of loose stones settling and my own ragged breathing. Finally, when the silence had stretched on for what felt like an eternity, I decided to risk a look outside. Slowly, painfully, I inched towards the opening of the crevice. I held my breath, ignoring the excruciating pain as I peeked out into the ravine. The landscape had changed, reshaped by the rock slide. Boulders and debris littered the ground, creating a chaotic maze of stone. But of the creature, there was no sign. "It's gone," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "It's really gone." Relief washed over me, so intense it was almost painful, but it was short-lived. As the adrenaline that had been keeping me going began to ebb, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. I tried to pull myself out of the crevice, but my body refused to cooperate. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through me. My left leg, which I was now certain was broken, hung uselessly. "Come on, Jacob," I muttered to myself, gritting my teeth against the pain. "You have to move. You have to get out of here." With agonizing slowness, I began to drag myself out of the crevice. It was a torturous process. Each inch gained a battle against pain and exhaustion. By the time I finally emerged into the open air, I was drenched in sweat and trembling with exertion. The sun was high in the sky now, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped me for so long. I lay there on the rocky ground, gasping for breath, trying to gather the strength to move again. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that sent ice through my veins. "No," I whispered, my eyes widening in terror. "No, please, no." Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound. There, not 20 feet away, stood the creature. It had been waiting, hidden behind a large boulder, watching as I struggled out of my hiding place. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in them that chilled me to my core. Intelligence, awareness, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. "Somebody help me!" My cries echoed through the ravine, unanswered. The beast took a step towards me, its massive form blocking out the sun. In that moment, faced with what I was sure would be my death, something inside me snapped. A surge of desperate energy coursed through my battered body. With a strength born of pure terror, I scrambled backwards, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs and leg. My hand closed around a loose rock, and without thinking, I hurled it at the creature's face. To my amazement, the stone struck true, hitting the beast square between the eyes. It reared back with a roar of pain and surprise, shaking its massive head. That moment of distraction was all I needed. I spotted a narrow gap between two large boulders, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. With the last reserves of my strength, I dragged myself towards it. I could hear the creature recovering behind me, its angry bellows spurring me on. Just as I felt its hot breath on the back of my neck, I managed to wedge myself into the gap. The beast's massive hand groped blindly for me, its claws scraping against stone mere inches from my face. I held my breath, pressing myself as far back into the crevice as I could. Hours passed like an eternity as I listened to the monster's frustrated grunts and sniffs just inches away. My entire world narrowed to the sound of its breathing, the occasional scrape of claws against stone. As the light began to fade, signaling the approach of another terrifying night, the creature's efforts to reach me intensified. It clawed at the rocks, sending showers of debris raining down on me. I could feel the vibrations as it threw its massive body against the boulders, trying to dislodge them. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was pleading with. "Please, just let this end." When silence finally fell, I dared to peek out, only to see two glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. A fresh wave of terror washed over me. It knew where I was. It was just waiting, biding its time. I retreated deeper into the crevice, praying for dawn and wondering if I'd live to see it. The night stretched on, an eternity of fear and pain. Every sound, every shadow, became the monster in my mind. As the first light of dawn filtered through the gaps in the rocks, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had outlasted the creature's patience. Maybe it had given up and moved on. But as I shifted, preparing to peek out of my hiding place once more, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing just outside the crevice. It was still there, still waiting, and I was trapped, injured and alone, with no way to call for help and no idea how long I could survive in this stone prison. As I huddled there, my body broken and my spirit nearly crushed, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This was far from over. The true test of survival was just beginning. As the first light of dawn filtered through the gaps in the rocks, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay in this crevice forever. My injuries needed treatment, and I was already feeling the effects of dehydration and hunger. It was time to risk everything on one desperate attempt at escape. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of the creature. The forest seemed eerily quiet, but I knew better than to trust that silence. It had fooled me before. "Okay, Jacob," I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely audible. "It's now or never. With agonizing slowness, I began to inch my way towards the opening of the crevice. Every movement sent waves of pain through my battered body. My broken ribs protested with each shallow breath, and my left leg, useless and probably broken, dragged behind me. As I neared the entrance, I paused, gathering what little strength I had left. This was it. Once I left this shelter, there would be no going back. I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my chest, and peered out into the ravine. The world outside was bathed in the soft light of early morning. Mist clung to the ground, giving the forest an otherworldly appearance. But most importantly, there was no sign of the creature. With a mixture of relief and trepidation, I dragged myself out of the crevice. The cool morning air felt like a shock against my skin after so many hours in the confines of the rock. As I lay there, gasping for breath and fighting waves of pain and dizziness, I tried to formulate a plan. I needed to find water, and then somehow make my way back to civilization. But in my current state, even sitting up seemed like an insurmountable challenge. "One step at a time," I muttered, gritting my teeth. Using a nearby boulder for support, I managed to pull myself into a sitting position. The world spun alarmingly, and for a moment I thought I might pass out, but I clung to consciousness with grim determination. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold, the snapping of branches somewhere in the forest above the ravine. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the tree line. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. "No," I whispered, terror clawing at my throat. "No, please, not again." But there was no denying what I was seeing. The creature was back, and this time, there was nowhere for me to hide. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had. Ignoring the screaming pain in my body, I began to drag myself along the ravine floor. I had no real destination in mind, no plan beyond getting away from the monster that was surely coming for me. Every few seconds, I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature bearing down on me. But the forest remained still, save for that occasional movement in the trees. Was it toying with me, enjoying the chase? I don't know how long I crawled, leaving a trail of blood and sweat on the rocky ground. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight. My world narrowed to the next handhold, the next inch of ground gained. Suddenly, my hand met empty air instead of solid ground. I looked up, realizing I had reached the edge of a steep embankment. Below, I could hear the sound of running water. For a brief moment, hope flared in my chest. Water meant a chance at survival. It might even lead me back to civilization. But before I could figure out how to navigate the steep slope, a roar shattered the morning silence. It was close. Too close. I turned, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. There, at the edge of the ravine, stood the creature. Its massive form was silhouetted against the rising sun, making it look even more monstrous. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew this was it. There would be no more hiding, no more near escapes. This was the final confrontation. The creature let out another roar, a sound of pure rage and hunger that shook the very air around us. Then it charged. I had no time to think, no time to plan. Pure instinct took over. As the monster bore down on me, I did the only thing I could. I let myself fall. The world spun crazily as I tumbled down the embankment. Rocks and branches tore at my already battered body. I could hear the creature's frustrated roars growing more distant as I fell. Then, with a shock that drove the air from my lungs, I hit water. The icy stream shocked me back to full consciousness, washing away some of the blood and grime. For a moment I floundered, the current threatening to pull me under. But survival instinct kicked in once more, and I managed to grab onto a partially submerged log. As I clung there, gasping for breath, I looked back up the embankment. The creature stood at the top, its massive form clearly visible now. It paced back and forth, letting out occasional roars of frustration, but it didn't follow me down. Relief washed over me, so intense it was almost painful. I had escaped. Against all odds, I had survived. With renewed determination, I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to civilization and safety. The cold water numbed some of my pain, washing away some of the blood and allowing me to think more clearly. I don't know how long I traveled downstream. Time seemed to blur, marked only by the steady flow of water and the throbbing of my injuries. But eventually, the dense forest began to thin, and I heard a sound that made my heart leap. The distant rumble of traffic. With a final surge of energy, I dragged myself out of the stream and up the bank. There, cutting through the trees, was a road. A real, paved road. Tears of relief streamed down my face as I crawled towards it. I was going to make it. I was going to survive. As I reached the roadside, I heard the blessed sound of an approaching vehicle. With the last of my strength, I pulled myself into view and waved my arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt, and I heard a door slam. Footsteps approached rapidly. "Oh my God!" a gruff voice exclaimed. "What happened to you, son?" I looked up into the concerned face of an older man, probably a local farmer or logger. He knelt beside me, his eyes wide with shock as he took in my battered condition. "Bigfoot," I managed to croak out. "It attacked me." In the forest, the man's expression changed from concern to skepticism in an instant. "Bigfoot? Son, I think you might have hit your head. Let's get you to a hospital." As he helped me into his truck, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of a new challenge. No one was going to believe what had happened to me. But as we drove away from the forest, leaving behind the nightmare that had nearly claimed my life, I made a silent vow. I would never set foot in those woods again, and somehow, someday, I would find a way to prove what I had experienced. For now, though, I was just grateful to be alive, heading towards safety and medical care. The true horror of what I had endured was only just beginning to sink in. The truck rumbled down the winding forest road, each bump sending waves of pain through my battered body. The old man who had found me, who introduced himself as Earl, kept glancing at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Son, I've lived in these parts for nigh on 60 years, Earl said, breaking the tense silence. "Never seen anything like what you're describing. You sure it wasn't a bear?" I shook my head weakly, wincing at the movement. "No, it wasn't a bear, it was..." Something else. Something impossible. Earl's skeptical expression deepened, but he didn't push the issue. Instead, he focused on getting me to the nearest town as quickly as possible. As we drove, the dense forest gradually gave way to scattered houses and small farms. The sight of these signs of civilization brought a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. I was out. I had survived. After what seemed like an eternity, we stumbled onto a dirt road, my relief quickly turning to dread as I realized how far I was from help. The bumpy ride was agony, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through my broken body. But I bit back my cries, focusing on the fact that I was finally heading towards safety. Almost there, Earl muttered, more to himself than to me. "Hang on, son. We'll get you fixed up." As we crested a hill, I saw it, a small town nestled in the valley below. Tears of relief sprang to my eyes at the sight. Earl pulled up in front of a small building with a faded sign that read, Oak Ridge Medical Clinic. Before I could even attempt to move, he was out of the truck and calling for help. A passing truck screeched to a halt, the driver's face contorting in horror at my appearance. Two men in scrubs rushed out of the clinic, their eyes widening as they took in my battered state. "What in the world happened to this guy?" one of them asked as they carefully lifted me onto a stretcher. "Says he was attacked by Bigfoot," Earl replied, his tone making it clear what he thought of that explanation. The medical staff exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism. I wanted to explain, to make them understand, but exhaustion and pain were quickly overtaking me. As they wheeled me into the clinic, the world began to fade to black. I drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices around me, of hands examining my injuries, of the sting of needles. Time lost all meaning as I floated in a haze of pain and medication. When I finally came fully awake, I found myself in a small hospital room. The steady beep of monitors filled the air, and I could feel the pull of an IV in my arm. A nurse noticed I was awake and quickly called for the doctor. Moments later, a middle-aged man in a white coat entered the room, his face grave as he looked over my chart. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "you've been through quite an ordeal. Multiple lacerations, 3 broken ribs, a fractured tibia, and a severe concussion. Can you tell me what happened?" I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my chest. "I was hiking in the Willamette National Forest," I began, my voice hoarse. Something attacked me. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was bigger, stronger. It walked on 2 legs. The doctor's expression remained neutral, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Mr. Miller, you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us in situations like that." "No," I insisted, frustration building. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real." The doctor made a non-committal sound, jotting something down in my chart. "We'll need to keep you here for observation for a few days. Your injuries are severe, and we want to monitor you for any signs of infection or internal bleeding." As he turned to leave, a thought struck me. "My campsite," I said, causing him to pause. "My gear. It's all still out there. It'll prove what happened." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "I'll contact the forest rangers. They can send out a search party to look for your belongings. For now, try to rest. You've been through a lot." As the door closed behind him, I slumped back against the pillows, exhaustion and frustration warring within me. I knew what I had experienced. It had been real, terrifyingly real. But how could I make them believe me? The next few days passed in a blur of pain medication, examinations, and increasingly frustrating conversations. Everyone, the doctors, the nurses, even the local sheriff who came to take my statement, looked at me with the same mix of pity and disbelief. "Now, Mr. Miller," the sheriff said, his pen poised over his notepad, "why don't you tell me exactly what happened out there?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I was on a solo hiking trip in the Willamette National Forest. On the second night I heard something. A howl, unlike anything I've ever heard before. Then I saw footprints, huge footprints. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he continued to write without comment. The next day I saw it. I continued, the memory sending a shiver down my spine. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick fur. It attacked me, threw me around like I was nothing. I only escaped by pure luck. As I finished my account, I looked up to see the sheriff regarding me with a mixture of skepticism and concern. "Mr. Miller," he said slowly, "are you familiar with the concept of cryptozoology?" I felt my heart sink. "You don't believe me?" The sheriff sighed, closing his notebook. "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that you've been through a traumatic experience. Now, we've sent rangers out to the area you described, but they haven't found any evidence of what you're describing." "But my campsite," I protested. "My gear, it was all left behind." "We found some scattered camping equipment," the sheriff admitted, "but it looked more like it had been disturbed by normal wildlife. Bears, most likely." I slumped back against the pillows, frustration and despair washing over me. They didn't believe me. No one believed me. As the sheriff left, promising to look into it further, I was left alone with my thoughts and the growing realization that this nightmare was far from over. The physical wounds would heal, but the memory of what I had experienced, and the knowledge that it was still out there, would haunt me for a long time to come. I stared out the window at the forest in the distance, a place that had once represented peace and adventure, but now held only terror and uncertainty. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I would never set foot in those woods again. But as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a new determination began to take root. They might not believe me now, but somehow, someday, I would find a way to prove what had happened, to make them understand the danger that lurked in the shadows of the forest. For now, though, I was just grateful to be alive, to be safe. The true challenge, living with the memory of what I had endured and convincing others of its reality, was only just beginning. The hospital room had become my prison. White walls, the constant beep of monitors, and the antiseptic smell that clung to everything. It was a far cry from the forest that had nearly claimed my life. But in some ways it felt just as suffocating. The physical pain of my injuries was a constant reminder of what I'd been through, but it was nothing compared to the mental anguish of not being believed. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, the door opened. I turned my head, hoping it might be someone, anyone, who would listen to my story with an open mind. Instead, I saw the now familiar face of Dr. Simmons, the psychiatrist the hospital had assigned to my case. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "How are you feeling today?" I sighed, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "Physically or mentally?" Dr. Simmons pulled up a chair, his expression sympathetic but guarded. "Both, if you're willing to share." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for another round of disbelief. "The pain is manageable, but I'm frustrated, Dr. Simmons. No one believes what happened to me out there." He nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. "Jacob, we've talked about this. The trauma you experienced." "It wasn't trauma playing tricks on my mind," I interrupted, my voice rising despite the pain it caused. "I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real." Dr. Simmons leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Jacob, I understand that what you experienced feels very real to you. But you have to consider the possibility that your mind might be protecting you from the true nature of the attack. Perhaps it was a bear, or—" "It wasn't a bear," I shouted, immediately regretting it as pain lanced through my chest. "It was bipedal, over 8 feet tall, covered in thick fur. It picked me up like I was nothing. No bear could do that." The psychiatrist sighed, making another note. "Jacob, have you ever heard of cryptozoology?" I felt my heart sink. This wasn't the first time someone had brought up this term. "You think I'm delusional?" I think you've been through a traumatic experience, Dr. Simmons said carefully. And sometimes our minds create explanations that are easier to accept than the reality of random animal attacks. Before I could argue further, there was a knock at the door. A nurse poked her head in. "Dr. Simmons, the sheriff is here to speak with Mr. Miller again." I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they had found something, some evidence that would prove I wasn't crazy. Sheriff Tanner entered the room, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "Mr. Miller, how are you feeling?" "I've been better," I replied, trying to sit up straighter. "Did you find anything?" The sheriff exchanged a glance with Dr. Simmons before answering. "We've completed our search of the area you described. We found your campsite, or what was left of it." My heart raced. "And? Did you see the footprints? The claw marks on the trees?" Sheriff Tanner's expression softened slightly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Mr. Miller, we found evidence of animal activity around your camp, but nothing unusual. Nothing that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife." "But the footprints," I insisted. "They were huge, clearly bipedal. Nothing normal could have made those." "We found some large prints," the sheriff admitted. "But our wildlife expert believes they were likely from a large bear, possibly standing on its hind legs." I slumped back against the pillows, despair washing over me. "You don't believe me either." Sheriff Tanner sighed, pulling up a chair next to my bed. "Son, I've been policing these woods for over 30 years. I've seen bear attacks, cougar attacks, even the occasional wolf. But I've never seen anything like what you're describing, and neither have any of my deputies or the forest rangers." "But that doesn't mean it's not real," I argued, my voice breaking. "Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Dr. Simmons stepped in, his voice gentle. "Jacob, no one is saying your experience wasn't real. But we have to consider all possibilities. The trauma of the attack, combined with the isolation and fear you experienced, could have affected your perception of events." I turned away, staring out the window at the distant tree line. The forest that had once been a place of peace and adventure now loomed like a dark threat on the horizon. Somewhere out there, I knew, the creature was still roaming free. And no one believed me. As if reading my thoughts, Sheriff Tanner spoke up. "Mr. Miller, I promise you, we're taking your report seriously. We've increased patrols in the area, and we're warning hikers to be extra cautious. But without concrete evidence..." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Without proof, my story would remain just that, a story. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medical checks, pain medication, and well-meaning but doubting visitors. My family arrived, their faces a mix of relief at my survival and worry about my mental state. I could see the doubt in their eyes as I recounted my experience, the same look I'd seen in the eyes of the doctors, the sheriff, everyone who'd heard my story. As night fell, I found myself alone in my room, the steady beep of monitors my only company. The pain medication was wearing off, and with it, the haze that had been dulling my thoughts. For the first time since my rescue, I had a moment of true clarity. I realized then that this was only the beginning of a new nightmare. The physical wounds would heal, but the memory of what I'd experienced, and the knowledge that no one believed me, would haunt me for a long time to come. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent vow to myself. I would find a way to prove what had happened. Somehow, someday, I would make them understand the danger that lurked in the shadows of the forest. But for now, I was trapped. Trapped in a hospital bed, trapped by my injuries, and trapped by the disbelief of those around me. The creature that had nearly killed me was still out there, free to roam the wilderness, while I was here, labeled as delusional or traumatized. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. This was far from over. The true battle, the fight to be believed, to warn others of the danger, was only just beginning. The morning light filtered through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the sterile white floor. I had barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of how to prove what I had experienced. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a knock at the door jolted me from my reverie. "Come in," I called out, wincing at the pain in my ribs. To my surprise, it wasn't a nurse or doctor, but a group of 3 people I didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as researchers from a local cryptozoology society. Mr. Miller, the leader, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, began. "I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson. We heard about your encounter. We'd like to hear your story, if you're willing to share it." For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Finally, someone who might believe me. But as I studied their faces, I saw the same skepticism I'd seen in everyone else's eyes. "You don't believe me either, do you?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Dr. Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Miller, we're here with an open mind. We've investigated many claims over the years, and while most have turned out to be misidentifications or hoaxes, we believe it's important to thoroughly examine every report." I sighed, then nodded. "All right, I'll tell you everything." For the next hour, I recounted my harrowing experience in excruciating detail. The researchers listened intently, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification or more details. As I spoke, I could see their expressions changing from polite skepticism to genuine interest. "Mr. Miller," one of the other researchers, a young man named Alex, spoke up. "Your description of the creature's behavior is fascinating. It seems to exhibit a level of intelligence and purposefulness that we don't typically see in known wildlife." I nodded eagerly. "Exactly. It wasn't just acting on instinct. It was hunting me, playing with me even." Dr. Thompson leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Jacob, would you be willing to return to the site with us, to show us exactly where these events took place?" My heart nearly stopped at the suggestion. Return to that place? The very thought sent a chill down my spine. I don't know if I can," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "The thought of going back there?" Dr. Thompson nodded understandingly. "I know it must be difficult, but your first-hand knowledge could be invaluable. We could document the site, look for any evidence that might have been overlooked." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The logical part of my brain knew this might be my only chance to prove what had happened. But the memory of those terrifying hours in the forest, of the creature's inhuman strength and relentless pursuit, made my heart race. After a long moment, I opened my eyes and nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The researchers coordinated with my doctors, who were hesitant but eventually agreed to release me for a day trip, provided I was accompanied by medical personnel. Sheriff Tanner was informed, and while he expressed doubts, he agreed to provide an escort. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Simmons pulled me aside. "Jacob, are you sure about this? Returning to the site of your trauma could be psychologically damaging." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure, Doctor. I need to do this. I need to prove what happened." The drive back to the forest was tense. As we approached the trailhead, I could feel my heart pounding, my palms sweating. The forest loomed before us, dark and forbidding. "We don't have to do this if you're not comfortable," Dr. Thompson said softly as we got out of the vehicles. I shook my head. "No, I need to do this. For my own peace of mind, if nothing else." Our group, consisting of the researchers, Sheriff Tanner, a deputy, and a paramedic, set off into the woods. With each step, memories of my terrifying ordeal flooded back. I led them to where I had first heard the creature, then to the site of my original camp. "Here," I said, pointing to an area of disturbed earth. "This is where I first saw the footprints." The researchers immediately set to work, photographing and measuring the area. But as they worked, I could see the doubt creeping back into their expressions. "Jacob," Dr. Thompson said gently, "these prints, they're consistent with a large bear." I shook my head vehemently. "No, You don't understand. They were much larger when I saw them, and they were clearly bipedal. Sheriff Tanner stepped in. Son, it's been several days. Rain and wildlife could have altered the prints. Frustration welled up inside me. But what about the claw marks on the trees? The destruction of my campsite? We continued on, retracing my frantic flight through the forest. But at every turn there seemed to be a rational explanation for what I had experienced. The crevice where I had hidden, a known bear den, the sounds I had heard, likely a combination of wind and normal forest animals. As we reached the ravine where I had made my final escape, I felt a sense of despair settling over me. There was no sign of the massive creature I had encountered, no evidence of the titanic struggle that had taken place here. I don't understand, I muttered, more to myself than to the others. It was here. It was real. Dr. Thompson placed a hand on my shoulder. Jacob, I believe that you experienced something traumatic here, but without concrete evidence. Her words were cut off by a sudden eerie silence that fell over the forest. The birds stopped chirping. The wind seemed to die down. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I saw the color drain from the faces of those around me as they finally heard what I had been trying to describe. What was that? Alex whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard the snap of branches breaking nearby. Something large was moving through the forest, heading our way. Sheriff Tanner drew his weapon, his face grim. Everyone back to the vehicles, now. As we hurried back down the trail, I couldn't help but feel a mix of vindication and terror. They had heard it. They knew now that I wasn't crazy, that there was something out there. But as we reached the trailhead and piled into the vehicles, I realized that this was far from over. We had no proof, no evidence beyond our own ears. And somewhere in those woods, the creature remained. A lethal secret waiting to be discovered. As we drove away, leaving the forest behind, I knew that this chapter of my life was far from closed. The search for truth and the struggle to be believed was only just beginning. The drive back from the forest was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The sound we had heard, that bone-chilling growl, hung in the air between us like an unspoken question. As we pulled into the hospital parking lot, Dr. Thompson turned to face me, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. Jacob, she began hesitantly, what we heard out there. I've never experienced anything like it in all my years of research. I nodded, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. Now you understand. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. Sheriff Tanner, who had been quiet for most of the ride, spoke up. Son, I won't deny that what we heard was unusual, but without concrete evidence, my hands are tied. I can't justify a full-scale search based on a sound, no matter how strange. His words hit me like a physical blow. Even after what they had experienced, they still couldn't, or wouldn't, fully believe me. The frustration and despair I had been holding back threatened to overwhelm me. As I was wheeled back to my hospital room, Dr. Simmons was waiting, his face etched with concern. Jacob, I heard about what happened in the forest. Are you all right? I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that surprised even me. All right? No, doctor, I'm not all right. I'm trapped in a nightmare that no one believes is real. Dr. Simmons sat down beside my bed, his voice gentle. Jacob, I understand that you're frustrated, but you have to understand our position. What you're describing, it goes against everything we know about the natural world. I turned to face him, my voice low and intense. And what about what you heard today? What we all heard? How do you explain that? He sighed, rubbing his forehead. There are many animals in the forest that can make unusual sounds, Jacob, without visual confirmation. I turned away, staring out the window at the distant tree line. The forest that had once been a place of peace and adventure now loomed like a dark threat on the horizon. Somewhere out there I knew the creature was still roaming free. And despite what they had heard, I was still alone in my knowledge of its existence. The next few days passed in a blur of medical checks, psych evaluations, and well-meaning but doubting visitors. My family came to see me, their faces a mix of relief at my recovery and concern about my mental state. I could see the doubt in their eyes as I recounted my experience, the same look I'd seen in the eyes of the doctors, the sheriff, everyone who'd heard my story. "Honey," my mother said, her voice trembling slightly, "maybe it would be good for you to talk to someone, a professional, I mean, about what you think you saw." I felt a surge of anger at her words. "I don't think I saw anything, Mom. I know what I experienced. It was real." My father placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression pained. "Son, we're just worried about you. These stories about Bigfoot, they're not healthy. You need to focus on recovering, on getting back to your normal life." Normal life. The phrase echoed in my head long after they had left. How could I go back to normal after what I had been through? How could I pretend that the world was the same when I knew what lurked in the shadows of the forest? As the days turned into weeks, I was finally released from the hospital. The physical wounds were healing, but the mental scars remained. I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound, scanning the tree line whenever I was outside. Sleep became a luxury, my nights haunted by vivid nightmares of glowing eyes and massive, fur-covered forms. I tried to return to my job in Portland, but I couldn't focus. The mundane tasks of everyday life seemed trivial in the face of what I had experienced. My co-workers' concerned glances and whispered conversations only added to my isolation. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing at my apartment window, staring out at the city lights. In the distance, I could just make out the dark mass of the forest. As I watched, a chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement among the trees, a large shape melting into the shadows. "It's not real," I muttered to myself, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. "It can't be here." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. The creature I had encountered, the Bigfoot that had nearly ended my life, was out there. And whether anyone believed me or not, I knew the truth. I turned away from the window, my gaze falling on my laptop. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to type. If no one would believe my spoken words, perhaps I could make them understand through writing. I would document every detail of my encounter, every sensation, every moment of terror. As I wrote, pouring my experience onto the digital page, I felt a strange mix of catharsis and dread. This was my truth, my reality, and even if the world doubted me, I would not let the memory of what I had endured fade away. Hours passed, the sky outside my window gradually lightening with the approach of dawn. As I finished typing, I sat back, exhausted but somehow lighter. The document on my screen held my story, my testimony of the impossible. But as I moved to save the file, a sudden gust of wind rattled my window. I jumped, my heart racing, and in that moment of distraction, my hand slipped on the keyboard. The screen flickered, and to my horror, the document disappeared. "No," I whispered, frantically trying to recover the file. But it was gone, lost in the digital ether. Just like the physical evidence of my encounter, my written testimony had vanished, leaving me once again with nothing but my memories and my scars. As the first rays of sunlight crept into my apartment, I slumped in my chair, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. It seemed that even fate was conspiring to keep my story untold. But as I sat there, watching the city come to life outside my window, a new determination began to take root. I may have lost my written account, but the truth remained. Somewhere out there, the creature still roamed. And as long as I drew breath, I would find a way to make the world understand the danger that lurked in the shadows of the forest. This was far from over. The true battle, living with the memory of what I had endured and finding a way to protect others from a threat they didn't believe existed, was only just beginning. The Montana wilderness stretched out before me, a vast expanse of pine-covered mountains and hidden valleys. As I guided my old Jeep Cherokee along the winding forest road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving into another world entirely. The radio had long since faded to static, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my tires and the whisper of wind through the trees. "You've got this, Sarah," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "It's just a weekend camping trip, nothing to worry about." But as the shadows lengthened and the forest grew denser, doubt began to creep in. I'd always loved the outdoors, but this was my first solo camping trip. The solitude I'd been craving now felt oppressive, almost menacing. I checked my watch. 6:45 p.m. The sun would be setting soon, and I needed to find a suitable campsite before darkness fell. As if on cue, I spotted a small turnoff leading to a clearing about 50 yards from the main road. Perfect. Pulling into the clearing, I cut the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was beautiful, but something about it set my nerves on edge. "Get a grip," I chided myself, grabbing my backpack and stepping out of the car. The air was crisp and clean, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off my unease. As I began to set up camp, the forest seemed to come alive around me. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, and every snapping twig made me whirl around, half expecting to see. What? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish. Of course, there was no answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me from the trees. I focused on the task at hand, methodically unpacking my gear and setting up my tent. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, and by the time I had a small fire going, I was feeling more like myself. As I sat by the fire, warming my hands and watching the flames dance, I tried to rationalize my earlier fears. "It's just your imagination running wild," I told myself. "You're not used to being alone out here." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink before fading to a deep, velvety blue. Stars began to appear, twinkling through gaps in the canopy above. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and for a moment, I forgot my apprehension. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that was neither human nor any animal I recognized. It was distant but unmistakable. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then another sound, closer this time. A heavy footfall, followed by the crack of a branch. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush, but nothing else. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking slightly. No response, but I could hear movement in the forest around me. Something large was circling my campsite, just beyond the reach of my light. "This isn't funny," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'm armed." It was a lie, but I hoped it might deter any would-be troublemakers. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, from somewhere in the darkness came a sound that turned my blood to ice, a low, rumbling growl that no human throat could produce. It was primal, filled with menace, and it was close. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling into my fire. My mind raced, trying to identify the source of the sound. Bear? Mountain lion? But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up with trembling hands as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I scanned the clearing, catching glimpses of movement at the edge of the trees. "It's not real," I whispered to myself, squeezing my eyes shut. "You're imagining things. There's nothing out there." But when I opened my eyes, I saw something that made my heart stop. Just beyond the circle of my campfire's light, two eyes glowed in the darkness. They were huge, set high off the ground and filled with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. For a split second, our gazes locked. I saw something in those eyes. A hunger, a malevolence that chilled me to my core. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, The creature vanished into the shadows. I sat frozen in my tent, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes stretched into hours, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Every sound from the forest, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to overtake fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my best efforts to stay alert, I found myself drifting off. My last conscious thought was a desperate hope that when I woke up, this would all prove to be nothing more than a bad dream. But as I slipped into an uneasy sleep, a part of me knew that the nightmare was only beginning. Whatever I had seen out there in the darkness, whatever had looked at me with those terrifying eyes, was still out there. And somehow, I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. The sound that jolted me awake in the early hours of the morning was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A howl that was part roar, part scream, and entirely inhuman. It echoed through the forest, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The howl faded, leaving behind a silence so complete it was deafening. And in that silence I heard something that made my blood run cold. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer. The inhuman howl that woke me still echoed in my ears as I sat frozen in my tent, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the pounding of my heart and the rustle of the tent fabric in the gentle night breeze. "It's just a wolf," I whispered to myself, desperately trying to rationalize the sound. But deep down, I knew that no wolf could produce a cry like that. It was too loud, too wrong. I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands, nearly dropping it in my haste. As I clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness of my tent, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. For a long moment I sat there, paralyzed by indecision. Should I stay put and hope whatever was out there would go away? Or should I make a run for my car? The decision was made for me when I heard it again. Heavy footsteps, closer now, circling my campsite. Each thunderous step sent vibrations through the ground, strong enough that I could feel them even through the floor of my tent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying than the noise had been. Gathering what little courage I had left, I unzipped the tent flap with shaking hands and poked my head out, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the clearing. At first, I saw nothing but trees and underbrush. Then, at the edge of the light, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something large shifted in the shadows, just beyond where my flashlight could reach. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Show yourself." As if in response, two eyes suddenly reflected back at me from the darkness. Huge glowing orbs set high off the ground. They blinked once, slowly, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized whatever I was looking at was far larger than any animal I'd ever encountered. For a split second we stared at each other, human and something else. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, the creature darted away, crashing through the underbrush. Heart racing, I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight beam dancing wildly as I tried to track the thing's movement. But it was gone, vanished into the forest as if it had never been there at all. "This can't be happening," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "This can't be real." But as I turned back to my campsite, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth just beyond my tent, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with distinct toes and a depth that spoke of incredible weight. "Oh my God," I breathed, crouching down to examine it closer. "What the hell made this?" As if in answer, another howl split the night air, closer this time. Too close, I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I caught a glimpse of something. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. But before I could process what I was seeing, It was gone, melting back into the shadows with unnatural speed and silence. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of here now. I dove back into my tent, grabbing my car keys and phone. To hell with the camping gear. I could come back for it in the daylight, if I ever came back at all. As I emerged from the tent, keys clutched tightly in my hand, I heard it again. That bone-chilling howl. So close now, it seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I ran for my car, heart pounding, every nerve screaming that I was being pursued. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with every step. I reached the Jeep and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. Come on, I pleaded, glancing over my shoulder. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. It was there, at the edge of the clearing. Bigfoot. There was no other word for it. 8 feet tall at least, covered in shaggy dark fur with arms that hung almost to its knees. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. A face that was almost, but not quite, human. Eyes that gleamed with a terrible intelligence, and a mouth that was twisted into what I could only describe as a snarl. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with a roar that shook me to my very core, it charged. I wrenched the car door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the creature reached me. The whole vehicle rocked as it slammed into the side, and I screamed as I saw its massive hand, more like a paw, really, slap against my window. With trembling hands, I jammed the key into the ignition and turned. The engine roared to life, and I threw the Jeep into reverse, tires spinning in the loose dirt as I accelerated backwards. The creature roared again, a sound of frustration and rage, and for a terrifying moment I thought it might actually be strong enough to stop the car. But then I hit the main road, threw the Jeep into drive, and floored it. As I sped away, I could see the creature in my rearview mirror standing in the middle of the road. It raised its head and let out one final chilling howl before disappearing into the forest. I drove for hours, too terrified to stop, jumping at every shadow and movement along the roadside. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon that I finally allowed myself to relax, just a little. But as the adrenaline wore off, I became aware of a throbbing pain in my ankle. Glancing down, I saw blood seeping through my jeans. Somehow, in the chaos of my escape, I'd been injured, a fact that only now registered through the fog of fear and shock. I knew I needed to find help, to report what had happened. But as the sun rose and the world began to wake up around me, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Who would believe me? Who would take seriously a story about being attacked by Bigfoot? As I pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside diner, my mind raced with questions. What had I seen out there in the forest? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? Little did I know, my nightmare was far from over. The true horror was yet to come. The fluorescent lights of the roadside diner flickered as I sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. My body ached, and the cut on my ankle throbbed with each heartbeat. The few other patrons gave me curious glances. I must have looked a mess, covered in dirt and leaves, my clothes torn. "You all right, honey?" The waitress, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, approached my table with a concerned look. I opened my mouth to speak, but where could I even begin? How could I explain what I'd just been through? I had an accident while camping, I managed to stammer out. She frowned, eyeing the blood on my jeans. "That looks nasty. You should get it looked at." I nodded absently, my mind still reeling from the night's events. "I will, thanks." As she walked away, I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. I was about to ask if they had a landline I could use when a breaking news alert flashed across the diner's small TV. Reports of a large, unidentified animal in the Bitterroot National Forest. Campers have been advised to evacuate the area immediately. My blood ran cold. They were talking about it, about what I'd seen. Part of me felt vindicated, It hadn't been my imagination, but a larger part was gripped by a new wave of terror. If they were issuing evacuation orders, that meant the creature was still out there. I had to warn them. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Ignoring the pain in my ankle, I limped to the counter. "Excuse me, do you have a phone I could use? It's an emergency." The waitress looked at me skeptically but nodded towards an old payphone near the restrooms. "It's your quarter, honey." With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, professional. "911, what's your emergency?" "I need to report an animal attack," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "In the Bitterroot National Forest." "Are you injured, ma'am?" "No. I mean, yes, but I'm safe now. But there are others out there. They don't know what they're dealing with. It's not a normal animal, it's..." "Ma'am, please calm down. What kind of animal are we talking about?" I hesitated. How could I say it without sounding crazy? "It's large, bigger than a bear, and it walks on 2 legs." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When the operator spoke again, her voice had a note of skepticism. "Ma'am, are you saying you saw a Bigfoot?" "I know how it sounds," I said desperately. "But I'm telling you, it's real. It attacked me. It's dangerous. You have to warn people." "All right, ma'am. We'll send a patrol car to check it out. Where are you now?" I gave her the name of the diner, and she assured me someone would be there soon to take my statement. As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't believe me, that no one would believe me. I was about to return to my booth when I saw it, through the diner's large front window, at the edge of the parking lot where the asphalt met the tree line. 2 glowing eyes, watching me. My heart stopped. It had followed me. Without thinking, I burst out of the diner, ignoring the startled cries of the other patrons. I had to get to my car, had to get away. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. And then I heard it. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls. It was coming. Finally, the door opened. I threw myself inside and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a massive fur-covered form burst from the tree line. Tires squealed as I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I could see it. The creature, Bigfoot, whatever it was, running after my car with impossible speed. "This isn't happening," I muttered, pressing the accelerator to the floor. "This can't be happening." But it was. The creature was gaining on me, its long strides eating up the distance between us. I swerved around a curve, the tires skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road. The forest flew by in a green blur as I pushed my Jeep to its limits. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was right behind me, ready to reach out with those massive hands, and a fallen tree loomed suddenly in the road ahead. I jerked the wheel hard, narrowly avoiding a collision. The Jeep fishtailed, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to flip. Somehow, I managed to regain control, but I'd lost precious seconds. As I accelerated again, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. It was running alongside the car now, just inside the tree line. "Go away," I screamed, though I knew it was futile. "Leave me alone." As if in response, it burst from the trees onto the road, directly in front of me. I had a split-second glimpse of its face, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, that almost human mouth twisted in a snarl, before I slammed on the brakes. The Jeep went into a skid. I felt a bone-jarring impact as I clipped the creature, sending it sprawling. Then the world was spinning, tumbling, a cacophony of shattering glass and crunching metal. When everything finally stopped moving, I found myself hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Blood trickled into my eyes from a cut on my forehead. Every part of me hurt. Through the shattered windshield, I could see the creature slowly getting to its feet. It seemed dazed but otherwise unharmed. As it turned its gaze towards me, I saw something in its eyes that chilled me to my core. Not just hunger or aggression, but a cold, calculating intelligence. It took a step towards the overturned Jeep, and I knew with absolute certainty that if it reached me, I was dead. With trembling hands, I fumbled with my seatbelt. I had to get out, had to run. But where? We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The creature was getting closer, each step deliberate, almost leisurely. It knew I had nowhere to go. Just as I managed to free myself from the seatbelt, collapsing painfully onto the roof of the overturned car, I heard it, the distant wail of sirens. The creature heard it too. It hesitated, looking back the way we'd come. For a moment I dared to hope that help was coming, that I might actually survive this nightmare. But then it turned back to me and I saw the decision in its eyes. It wasn't going to let its prey escape. As it lunged for the car, I did the only thing I could. I kicked out the remaining glass of the driver's side window and crawled out, ignoring the searing pain as shards cut into my hands and knees, and then I was running, stumbling really, into the forest. Behind me I heard the screech of tearing metal as the creature ripped into the overturned Jeep. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The sound of pursuit was close behind. Too close. As I burst into a small clearing, I risked a glance over my shoulder. What I saw made my blood run cold. The creature was there, barely 10 feet behind me, its massive form barreling through the underbrush as if it were nothing. I pushed myself harder, knowing that to slow down even for a moment meant certain death. But I could feel my strength failing, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. The creature's hot breath on the back of my neck told me it was now mere inches away. In that moment, I knew with terrible certainty that I wasn't going to make it. But just as I felt its massive hand closing around my shoulder, the forest ahead suddenly gave way to another clearing. And there, like a miracle, stood an old, abandoned cabin. With one final, desperate burst of speed, I threw myself towards the cabin, praying that its rotting walls would provide some kind of refuge from the nightmare at my heels. My lungs burned as I sprinted towards the dilapidated cabin, the thunderous footfalls of the creature right behind me. With a final burst of desperate energy, I hurled myself at the weathered door, praying it would give way. The rotting wood splintered under my weight, and I tumbled inside, landing hard on a dusty wooden floor. Ignoring the pain shooting through my body, I scrambled to my feet and slammed what was left of the door shut, fumbling with the rusty lock. For a moment there was silence. Then a deafening roar shook the entire structure, and I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "This isn't happening," I whispered, my voice hoarse and trembling. "This can't be real." But the massive shadow that fell across the cabin's dirty window told me otherwise. It was out there, circling, looking for a way in. I pressed my back against the far wall, desperately scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A rickety table, a few broken chairs, and not much else. In one corner, a narrow staircase led to what I assumed was an attic or loft. Suddenly, the whole cabin shook as something massive slammed against the wall. Dust and splinters rained down from the ceiling. I covered my ears as another bone-chilling roar filled the air, so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. "Go away," I screamed, knowing it was futile. "Leave me alone." In response, I heard the sound of rending wood. Looking up, I saw massive claws tearing through the boarded-up window, sending splinters flying everywhere. I caught a glimpse of matted fur and a gleaming eye peering through the growing hole. Panic surged through me. I had to find a way out, or at least somewhere to hide. My eyes darted to the staircase. It was my only option. As I dashed for the stairs, I heard the window give way completely. The creature let out a triumphant bellow that shook me to my core. I took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the protest of my battered body. The upper level was little more than a dusty loft, empty save for a few moldy boxes and what looked like an old hunting rifle propped in one corner. I lunged for the rifle, praying it was still functional. Below, I could hear the creature moving around, its heavy footsteps making the floorboards groan. It let out a low, guttural sound, almost like it was sniffing the air, searching for my scent. With shaking hands, I checked the rifle. It was old, probably hadn't been fired in years, but it seemed intact. I found a small box of ammunition nearby and loaded the gun as quietly as I could, wincing at every tiny click and snap. The footsteps below had stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, without warning, the entire cabin shuddered as something massive began to climb the stairs. I raised the rifle, aiming it at the top of the staircase. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep it steady. "Stay back," I shouted, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "I'm armed." The creaking of the stairs stopped. For a heartbeat, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it had understood me, that it would leave. Then the creature's massive head appeared at the top of the stairs and all hope fled. Its eyes locked onto mine, filled with a cold, predatory intelligence that chilled me to my bones. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth that looked capable of crushing bone. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked back with a roar of pain and fury. For a moment, I thought I'd actually managed to wound it. But as the smoke cleared, I saw with horror that the bullet had only grazed its shoulder. And now it was angry. With a bellow that shook dust from the rafters, it charged up the remaining stairs. I fired again, and again, my shots going wide in my panic. The creature barreled towards me, seemingly unaffected by the few bullets that did find their mark. As it closed the distance between us, I saw my death in its eyes. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw every detail with crystal clarity. The coarse fur matted with leaves and twigs, the massive hands ending in razor-sharp claws, the almost human-like face twisted in a mask of rage. Just as its enormous hand reached for me, the floor beneath us gave way with a thunderous crack. Suddenly we were falling, a tangle of limbs and splintered wood. I hit the ground floor hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. Pain exploded through my body, and for a moment the world went dark around the edges. When my vision cleared, I found myself lying amid a pile of broken boards and dust. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear it moving, letting out low growls of pain or fury. Ignoring the screaming protest of my battered body, I forced myself to my feet. I had to get out of here now. I stumbled towards the door, my legs threatening to give out with every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature starting to recover, its growls turning into roars of rage. Just as I reached the doorway, I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down to see a massive fur-covered hand wrapped around my leg, its claws digging into my skin. I screamed, more in terror than pain, and kicked out wildly. By some miracle, my foot connected with the creature's face. It let out a bellow of pain and released its grip. Not daring to look back, I burst out of the cabin and into the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I ran blindly, driven by pure adrenaline and the primal need to survive. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. Each thunderous footfall sent a jolt of terror through me, spurring me to run faster, even as my body begged me to stop. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep embankment. I rolled and bounced, unable to stop my descent, until I finally came to rest at the bottom of a ravine. For a moment I lay there, dazed and in pain. Then I heard it, the sound of heavy breathing and snapping branches. It was coming down the slope after me. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had. I scrambled to my feet and started running again, following the course of a small stream that flowed through the ravine. As I ran, I could hear the creature's frustrated roars echoing off the ravine walls. It was having trouble navigating the steep, rocky terrain. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could outlast it. But as I rounded a bend in the ravine, my heart sank. Looming before me was a sheer rock face at least 30 feet high. A dead end. I turned, ready to retrace my steps, but froze as I saw a massive shape silhouetted at the other end of the ravine. The creature had caught up. It let out a triumphant roar that echoed off the rock walls, making it sound like I was surrounded by a dozen of these monsters. As it began to advance towards me, I pressed my back against the rock face, my mind racing desperately for a way out. But there was nowhere left to run. As the creature closed in, its eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction, I knew with terrible certainty that this was it. This was how I was going to die. Just then I felt something shift behind me. A section of the rock face gave way, revealing a narrow crevice. Without thinking, I squeezed into the opening, ignoring the sharp rocks that tore at my skin. The creature let out a bellow of frustration as it reached the rock face. I could hear its claws scrabbling at the opening, feel its hot breath as it tried to reach me. But the crevice was too narrow. It couldn't get to me. As I pressed myself deeper into the crevice, I heard the creature's roars of fury slowly fade into low, menacing growls. It was waiting me out. In the darkness of my rocky refuge, I closed my eyes and tried to calm my racing heart. I was safe, for now. But how long could I stay here? And what would happen when I eventually had to come out? As the reality of my situation sank in, I realized with a sinking feeling that my ordeal was far from over. The true test of survival was yet to come. I don't know how long I huddled in that narrow crevice, my body trembling from exhaustion, fear, and the cold dampness of the rock. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness. The only constant was the sound of heavy breathing and occasional growls from the creature outside, reminding me that my nightmare was far from over. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain from my various injuries set in. My ankle throbbed where the creature had grabbed me, and I could feel warm blood trickling from numerous cuts and scrapes. But worse than the physical pain was the gnawing terror that filled every fiber of my being. "Think, Sarah," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "You can't stay here forever." I knew I needed to find a way out, but the thought of facing that monster again paralyzed me with fear. Every time I heard it move or growl outside, my heart would race, and I'd press myself further into the crevice, as if I could somehow melt into the rock itself. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell. But gradually, I became aware of a change. The sounds from outside were growing fainter, more distant. Was it possible? Had the creature given up? Hope flickered in my chest, but I quickly suppressed it. I couldn't afford to let my guard down now. Slowly, cautiously, I inched towards the opening of the crevice. My eyes, adjusted to the darkness, were momentarily blinded by the dim light filtering through the trees. As my vision cleared, I scanned the ravine, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. But the ravine appeared empty, no sign of the massive fur-covered form that had been my pursuer. Had it really left? I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound of movement. Nothing but the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a bird. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady my nerves. "You can do this. Just be careful." Inch by agonizing inch, I squeezed out of the crevice. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, stiff from being cramped in one position for so long. As I finally emerged fully into the ravine, I took a moment to assess my surroundings. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. How long had I been in there? It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few hours. I looked back at the crevice that had been my sanctuary. It was barely visible, just a narrow crack in the rock face. If I hadn't fallen against it at just the right moment. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest above the ravine and I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Had it been waiting for me to come out? Was this all part of its hunt? "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice echoed off the ravine walls, seeming impossibly loud in the quiet forest. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, from somewhere in the trees above, came a low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. It was still here. Panic surged through me. I had to move, had to get out of this ravine. But which way? Going back the way I'd come meant facing the steep slope I'd tumbled down earlier. Going forward. My decision was made for me as a massive form crashed through the underbrush at the top of the ravine. The creature, Bigfoot, my mind supplied hysterically, stood there for a moment, its eyes locked on me. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, it began to descend the slope. I turned and ran, ignoring the pain that shot through my battered body with every step. The ravine floor was treacherous, littered with loose rocks and fallen branches, but fear lent me a grace I never knew I possessed. Behind me I could hear the creature's pursuit, its heavy footfalls growing closer with each passing second. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. It was gaining on me, its long strides eating up the distance between us. Just ahead, I saw where the ravine opened up into a wider clearing. If I could make it there, maybe I'd have a chance to. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I rolled, scrambling to get back to my feet, but I knew it was too late. The creature was upon me. As I looked up, I found myself face to face with the nightmare that had been pursuing me. Bigfoot towered over me, its massive form blocking out the sky. This close I could smell its musky animal odor, see the leaves and twigs matted in its thick fur. But it was its face that held me transfixed. The face that was almost, but not quite, human. Eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. And its mouth, dear God. Its mouth was twisted into what I could only describe as a grin. A predator's grin, full of yellowed teeth that looked capable of crushing bone. Time seemed to slow as the creature reached for me. I saw its massive hand descending, claws extended. In that moment I knew with absolute certainty that this was it. This was how I was going to die. But some primal instinct for survival kicked in. My hand closed around a rock, and without conscious thought I swung it with all my might. The impact sent shockwaves up my arm. The creature roared in pain and fury, stumbling back a step. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the path ahead of me. I burst out of the ravine and into the clearing beyond, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. But I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. My strength was failing, my injuries taking their toll. Just ahead, I saw what looked like the remains of an old cabin, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. It wasn't much, but it was the only shelter in sight. I threw myself through the doorway, collapsing onto a floor covered in rotting leaves and debris. Behind me, I heard the creature's roar of frustration. It was too big to fit through the narrow doorway. For a moment, I dared to hope that I was safe. Then the entire structure shook as the creature slammed into it. Wood splintered and cracked. Dust and debris rained down from what was left of the roof. I looked around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. In the corner, half buried under fallen timbers, I saw something metallic glinting in the fading light. A pipe? I lunged for it, my fingers closing around cool metal just as the wall behind me gave way with a thunderous crash. I whirled around, the pipe held before me like a sword. The creature filled the gaping hole where the wall had been, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. As it took a step towards me, I swung the pipe with all my remaining strength. There was a sickening thud as the pipe connected with the creature's head. It let out a roar of pain and fury that shook the very foundations of the cabin. But it didn't go down. Instead, its massive hand shot out faster than I could have believed possible and grabbed my ankle. I screamed as I felt its claws dig into my flesh. The pipe fell from my grasp as I was yanked off my feet. The world spun crazily as the creature lifted me, dangling me upside down before its face. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something in its gaze that chilled me to my very soul. Not just hunger or rage, but a cold, calculating intelligence. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was something else entirely. As its monstrous face loomed closer, its hot breath reeking of decay, I knew with terrible certainty that this was the end. My last thought before consciousness fled was a desperate wish that I would wake up and find this had all been nothing more than a horrible nightmare. But as darkness claimed me, the creature's triumphant roar echoing in my ears, I knew that this nightmare was all too real, and it was far from over. The first thing I became aware of was pain. It radiated through every inch of my body, a dull, throbbing ache punctuated by sharp stabs whenever I tried to move. The second thing was the sound of birdsong, cheerful and utterly at odds with the horror I'd just experienced. I opened my eyes slowly, wincing at the bright sunlight filtering through the trees above. For a moment I lay there, disoriented and confused. Where was I? What had happened? Then it all came rushing back. The chase, the creature, the cabin. Panic surged through me and I sat up abruptly, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over me. But I was alone. The clearing around me was peaceful, showing no signs of the terrifying confrontation that had taken place. When? Last night? How long had I been unconscious? I was lying in a small glade, surrounded by dense forest. There was no sign of the dilapidated cabin where I'd made my last stand against the creature. Had I imagined it all? But the pain in my body and the state of my clothes, torn, bloodied, and caked with dirt, told a different story. This had been real. All of it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" Only the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze answered me. I was alone. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through my battered body. I took stock of my injuries. Cuts, bruises, and scrapes covered nearly every inch of exposed skin. My ankle, where the creature had grabbed me, was swollen and discolored. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived. "Okay, Sarah," I muttered to myself, trying to keep the panic at bay. "Think. You need to get out of here." I looked around, trying to get my bearings. Nothing looked familiar. How far had the creature carried me while I was unconscious? And why had it left me here alive? A chill ran down my spine at the thought. Was it still out there watching me, waiting? I pushed the thought aside. I couldn't afford to give in to panic now. I needed to find help, to get back to civilization. Picking a direction at random, they all looked the same to me. I started walking. Each step was agony, but the fear of staying in one place, of the creature finding me again, drove me forward. As I walked, I tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the creature's face looming over me, its triumphant roar as I lost consciousness. How had I ended up here? Had it carried me, intending to... what? Eat me later? The thought made me sick. But then why leave me alive? Nothing about this made sense. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the endless sea of trees. My throat was parched, my stomach cramping with hunger, but I didn't dare stop to look for water or food. I had to keep moving. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it. The distant sound of traffic. A road. Hope gave me a second wind and I quickened my pace, ignoring the protests of my battered body. The sound grew louder and finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and saw it. A two-lane highway stretching off into the distance. I stumbled onto the shoulder of the road, waving my arms frantically at the first car I saw approaching. It zoomed past, the driver not even slowing down. I couldn't blame them. I must have looked like a mad woman covered in dirt and blood, my clothes in tatters. But the next car, an old pickup truck, slowed to a stop. An elderly man leaned out the window, his eyes wide with concern. "Good Lord, miss, are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with a local accent. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Instead, to my horror and embarrassment, I burst into tears. The next few hours passed in a blur. The kind stranger, Bob, he said his name was, drove me to the nearest hospital, peppering me with questions that I could barely answer. How had I ended up in the woods? What had happened to me? I mumbled something about a camping trip gone wrong, a fall down a ravine. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Who would believe me? At the hospital, I was immediately whisked away by concerned nurses. They cleaned my wounds, took x-rays, asked me endless questions. I stuck to my story about a camping accident, even as the doctor frowned at the nature of some of my injuries. "These lacerations on your ankle," he said, examining the swollen, discolored skin. "They almost look like claw marks." I felt a chill run down my spine. I must have caught it on some thorns when I fell. I lied, avoiding his gaze. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned to a police officer who had arrived to take my statement. "Miss Adams," the officer said, flipping open a notebook. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was my chance to tell someone, to warn them about the creature out there in the woods. But as I opened my mouth, I saw the skepticism in the officer's eyes, the way the nurse was looking at me with pity. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. I went camping," I began, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "I wasn't as prepared as I should have been. I got lost, fell down a ravine. I must have hit my head because things are fuzzy after that." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "And how did you end up so far from your campsite? The area where you were found is miles from any designated camping grounds." I shook my head, feigning confusion. "I don't know. Like I said, things are fuzzy. I must have wandered in my confusion." He asked a few more questions, but I could tell he was losing interest. Just another unprepared camper who'd gotten in over her head. Nothing to see here. As the officer left, I overheard him talking to the doctor outside my room. "Probably just another city slicker who thought camping would be fun," the officer was saying. "Got in over her head and panicked. We see it all the time." I wanted to scream at them, to tell them about the monster that was out there. But who would believe me? I had no proof, no evidence, just my battered body, and a story that sounded insane even to my own ears. As night fell and the hospital quieted, I lay in my bed staring out the window at the distant forest. It was out there somewhere, I knew, waiting, watching, and I was the only one who knew the truth. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind replaying the terrifying events over and over. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous form. Every sound outside my door made me tense, expecting to see glowing eyes and yellowed teeth. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back to my normal life pretending this hadn't happened. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed people to believe me, to understand the danger that was out there. As a nurse came in to check on me, I put on my best smile. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Could I use a phone? There's someone I need to call." Little did I know, this call would be the first step down a path that would change my life forever. The truth was out there, and I was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The hospital room felt suffocating as I waited for my friend, Mike, to arrive. I'd called him earlier, desperate for a familiar face, someone who might believe my story. The nurses had been kind but distant, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and skepticism whenever I tried to explain what had really happened. As I sat there, my mind kept replaying the horrifying events in the forest. The creature's roar, its massive form pursuing me relentlessly, those intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. I shuddered, pulling the thin hospital blanket tighter around my shoulders. A soft knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts. "Come in," I called, my voice still hoarse from screaming. Mike entered, his face a mask of concern. "Sarah, my God, what happened to you?" I felt a wave of relief wash over me at the sight of my friend. "Mike, thank you for coming. I don't know where to begin." He pulled up a chair next to my bed, his eyes taking in my bandages and bruises. "The nurse said something about a camping accident, but this looks way worse than a simple fall." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it. My chance to tell someone the truth, to have someone believe me. "Mike, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I swear to you, it's the truth." And so I told him everything. The creature in the forest, the chase, the terrifying confrontation in the abandoned cabin. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief growing in Mike's eyes, replaced by something worse. Concern, not for my safety, but for my mental state. "Sarah," he said gently when I finished, Are you sure that's what happened? I mean, you said yourself you hit your head. Maybe what? I snapped, frustration boiling over. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. You think I did this to myself? Mike held up his hands placatingly. No, of course not. But you have to admit, it sounds impossible. Bigfoot? Come on, Sarah. You know those are just stories. I felt tears of frustration welling up in my eyes. I know how it sounds, Mike. But I'm telling you, it was real. It was there, right in front of me. It tried to kill me. A nurse poked her head in, drawn by the sound of our raised voices. Is everything all right in here? Mike gave her a reassuring smile. Everything's fine, thank you. We're just talking. As the nurse left, Mike turned back to me, his expression serious. Look, Sarah, I believe that you believe what you're saying. But you have to understand how this sounds to everyone else. A giant, man-like creature attacking you in the woods, it's crazy. I finished for him, my voice bitter. You think I'm crazy? I didn't say that, Mike protested, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me. No one did. Just then, there was another knock at the door. A man in a rumpled suit entered, flashing a badge. Miss Adams, I'm Detective Johnson. I'd like to ask you a few more questions about your incident. Mike stood up. I should go. Sarah, I'll come back later, okay? Try to get some rest. As Mike left, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. If my own friend didn't believe me, how could I expect anyone else to? Detective Johnson took the seat Mike had vacated, pulling out a notebook. Now, Miss Adams, can you walk me through what happened again? And this time, I'd appreciate the truth. I bristled at his tone. I have been telling the truth. No one believes me, but it doesn't make it any less true. The detective's eyes narrowed. Miss Adams, we found your campsite. There was no sign of any large animal activity. No tracks. Nothing to corroborate your story about what did you call it? A Bigfoot? It was there, I insisted, my voice rising. Just because you couldn't find any evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen. What happened to the cabin? He asked suddenly. The one you said you fought the creature in? I blinked, thrown off by the question. I don't know. The last thing I remember is being in the cabin, and then I woke up in the clearing where that man found me. Detective Johnson made a note, his expression skeptical. Miss Adams, we've searched the area thoroughly. There is no cabin matching your description anywhere near where you were found. I felt a chill run down my spine. How was that possible? But it was there. I swear it was there. The detective sighed, closing his notebook. Miss Adams, I'm going to be straight with you. Your story doesn't add up. We have no evidence of any large predator in the area, no signs of the struggle you described, and no cabin. What we do have is a young woman who went camping alone, got in over her head and sustained some serious injuries. You think I did this to myself? I asked incredulously. I think you had an accident hit your head and your mind filled in the blanks with an unusual story, he replied diplomatically. It's not uncommon in traumatic situations. I shook my head, frustration and despair warring within me. I know what I saw, what I experienced. It was real. Detective Johnson stood up, his expression a mixture of pity and exasperation. Miss Adams, I'm going to recommend you speak with one of our counselors. Traumatic experiences can be difficult to process, and sometimes our minds play tricks on us. As he left, I felt utterly alone. No one believed me. Not Mike, not the police, not even the medical staff. To them, I was just another victim of my own inexperience, or worse, a lunatic spinning tales of monsters in the woods. I turned to look out the window, my eyes drawn to the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. It was out there somewhere, I knew it. The creature that had nearly killed me, that had turned my life upside down in the span of a single night. And I was the only one who knew the truth. As night fell and the hospital quieted, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep trying to convince people who were determined not to believe me. I needed proof. I needed to go back. The thought sent a shiver of fear through me. The memory of those terrifying hours in the forest was still fresh. The pain of my injuries a constant reminder of how close I'd come to death. But what choice did I have? I waited until the night nurse had made her rounds, then quietly got out of bed. My legs shook as I stood, but determination gave me strength. I found my clothes, now clean but still torn, in a bag by the bed. As I dressed, wincing at every movement, I tried to formulate a plan. I had no car, no phone, no supplies. But I had to try. I had to find some evidence, something to prove that I wasn't crazy, that the creature was real. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. Was I really going to do this? Go back to the place where I'd nearly died to face a monster that no one else believed existed? But as I hesitated, I heard it, distant but unmistakable. A howl, carried on the night wind. A sound that sent chills down my spine and made my heart race. It was out there, and it was calling me back. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. My nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The cool night air hit me like a slap as I stepped out of the hospital, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to return to the safety of my hospital bed. But I couldn't. Not when I was the only one who knew the truth about what lurked in those woods. I had managed to slip out unnoticed thanks to the late hour and a bit of luck. Now, standing on the sidewalk outside the hospital, the enormity of what I was about to do hit me. I was going back. Back to where that thing had nearly killed me. "You can do this, Sarah," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the trembling in my hands. "You have to do this." My first challenge was transportation. I had no car, and calling a taxi to drive me into the middle of the forest in the dead of night wasn't exactly an option. As I pondered my dilemma, I spotted a row of bicycles near the hospital entrance, likely belonging to staff members. Guilt gnawed at me as I approached the bikes, but desperation overrode my moral compass. I chose an old, sturdy-looking mountain bike, promising myself I'd return it as soon as I could. As I pedaled away from the hospital, each rotation of the wheels sent jolts of pain through my battered body. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the fear that gripped me as I headed towards the forest. The road stretched out before me, eerily empty at this late hour. In the distance, I could see the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. My forest, the place where my life had changed forever. As I rode, my mind raced. What exactly was I hoping to find? Footprints? Fur? Some tangible evidence that would prove I wasn't crazy? That the creature was real? Lost in thought, I almost missed the turnoff that led to the forest access road. I veered sharply, nearly losing control of the bike on the loose gravel. The forest loomed before me, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the weak beam of the bike's headlight. I slowed to a stop at the edge of the trees, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Come on, Sarah," I whispered, trying to summon my courage. "You've come this far." With shaking hands, I pulled out the small flashlight I'd managed to snag from the hospital. Its beam seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast darkness of the forest, but it was all I had. I left the bike propped against a tree and stepped into the woods. The familiar sense of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils, bringing with them a flood of terrifying memories. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous form. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I tried to retrace my steps from that nightmarish chase, but in the darkness, everything looked different. Had I run this way? Or was it that way? The trees all blurred together, a maze of shadows and hidden dangers. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled into a small clearing. My heart leapt as I recognized it. This was where I'd first encountered the creature, where I'd seen those terrifying eyes gleaming in the darkness. I swept my flashlight around, searching for any sign of the monster's presence. A footprint, a tuft of fur, anything, but the forest floor was undisturbed, showing no evidence of the terrifying chase that had taken place here. "There has to be something," I muttered, frustration building. "It was here. I know it was here." As if in response to my words, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. It was here. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting frantically from shadow to shadow. Where was it? How close? Another growl, closer this time. I could hear heavy footsteps, branches cracking under massive weight. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "I'm warning you." But what could I do? I was alone, unarmed, facing a creature that had nearly killed me once before. A dark shape moved at the edge of my flashlight's beam. For a split second I saw it. A massive, fur-covered form, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes gleaming in the darkness. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, blind panic driving me forward. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. In my terror, I lost all sense of direction. Trees blurred past me, roots seemed to reach up to trip me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, gasping for breath, I burst out of the tree line. To my shock, I found myself back where I'd started, at the forest access road where I'd left the bike. I whirled around, expecting to see the creature right behind me. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest. Had I imagined it? No, I was sure I'd seen it, heard it. It had been there, so close I could almost smell its musky odor. But now, as I stood there trembling on the edge of the road, doubt began to creep in. Where was the evidence I'd come for? I had nothing to show for my terrifying excursion into the forest. No footprints, no fur, no photographs. Nothing but my own fear and the memory of what I'd seen. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain from my various injuries came flooding back. I slumped against a tree, exhaustion and despair washing over me. What was I doing out here? Had I really thought I could prove anything? Maybe they were right. Maybe it had all been in my head. A hallucination brought on by fear and trauma. But even as the thought formed, I knew it wasn't true. I had seen it, felt it. The creature was real, whether anyone believed me or not. As dawn began to break, casting long shadows through the trees, I made my way back to the borrowed bike. I had to get back to the hospital before they realized I was missing. But as I pedaled away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back one last time at the wall of trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a large shape melting back into the shadows. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. One thing was certain, though. My search for the truth was far from over. The creature was out there, and somehow, some way, I was going to prove it. No matter what it took. As I rode back towards the hospital, my mind raced with plans. I needed resources, equipment. I needed help from someone who would believe me. But who? Little did I know. My ill-fated excursion into the forest that night was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, and it would test not just my courage, but my very sanity. The hospital room felt like a prison as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. It had been hours since my ill-fated excursion into the forest, and the adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving me exhausted and aching. But sleep eluded me, chased away by the vivid memories of what I'd experienced. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, intelligent eyes staring at me from the darkness. I could hear the creature's growl, feel the ground shake with its footsteps. The fear was a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of my mind. A soft knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts. "Come in," I called, my voice hoarse. Dr. Emerson, the psychiatrist the hospital had assigned to my case, entered with a gentle smile. Good morning, Sarah. How are you feeling today? I sat up, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. I'm fine, I lied, avoiding her gaze. She pulled up a chair beside my bed, her expression sympathetic. Sarah, I understand you had a difficult night. The nurses reported that you were missing from your room for several hours. My heart raced. I had hoped to avoid this conversation, to pretend I'd never left. But of course they had noticed. I needed some air, I mumbled, knowing how weak the excuse sounded. Dr. Emerson leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sarah, I'm here to help you. But I can't do that if you're not honest with me. Where did you go last night? I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I went back to the forest, I admitted, watching her face carefully for her reaction. To her credit, Dr. Emerson's expression remained neutral. I see. And why did you feel the need to do that? Because no one believes me. The words burst out of me, fueled by frustration and fear. I know what I saw out there. It was real, and I thought if I could find some evidence, some proof. Proof of the creature you believe attacked you? Dr. Emerson asked, her tone carefully non-judgmental. I nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I know how it sounds. I know you all think I'm crazy. But I swear to you, it was real. Dr. Emerson was silent for a moment, her pen poised over her notepad. Sarah, I want you to know that I don't think you're crazy. Traumatic experiences can affect our minds in complex ways. Sometimes our brains create explanations for things we can't understand or process. You think I imagined it, I said flatly, disappointment settling in my stomach like a lead weight. I think you experienced something traumatic, she replied carefully, and your mind is trying to make sense of it. But Sarah, going back into that forest alone was incredibly dangerous. You could have been seriously hurt. I laughed bitterly. Hurt by what? The creature you don't believe exists? Dr. Emerson sighed. By any number of things. You're still recovering from your injuries. The forest can be dangerous, especially at night. I turned away, staring out the window at the distant line of trees. It's out there, I murmured more to myself than to her. Waiting. Watching. Sarah, Dr. Emerson's voice was gentle but firm. I'd like to discuss the possibility of medication to help you deal with the anxiety and trauma you're experiencing. I whirled back to face her, anger flaring. I don't need medication. I need someone to believe me. Just then, there was another knock at the door. A nurse poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a news crew here. They're asking to speak with Miss Adams about her Bigfoot encounter. My heart sank. How had they found out? Who had told them? Dr. Emerson stood up, her expression concerned. I'll take care of this. Sarah, please try to rest. We'll talk more later. As she left, I could hear raised voices in the hallway. The word Bigfoot floated through the air, followed by exclusive and eyewitness account. I sank back into my pillows, a mixture of dread and strange excitement churning in my stomach. Part of me wanted to tell my story, to have someone listen without immediately dismissing me as crazy. But another part, the part that still trembled at the memory of those glowing eyes in the darkness, wanted nothing more than to hide away and forget it had ever happened. The day passed in a blur of nurses, doctors, and more visits from Dr. Emerson. I refused to speak to the news crew, but I could see them camped out in the parking lot from my window, their cameras trained on the hospital entrance. As night fell, the fear that had been simmering all day began to rise. The shadows in my room seemed to grow, reaching out with dark tendrils. Every sound from the hallway made me jump, half expecting to see a massive fur-covered form fill the doorway. I tried to rationalize my fear. I was safe here, surrounded by people. The creature couldn't reach me here. But the memory of its roar, of its terrifying strength and speed, was too fresh, too real. Unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the window. The forest loomed in the distance, a dark mass against the night sky. Was it out there now, prowling the woods? Hunting? Or was it, as everyone seemed to believe, nothing more than a figment of my traumatized imagination? A movement at the edge of the parking lot caught my eye. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a large, shadowy figure moving between the cars. But when I blinked, it was gone. "You're imagining things," I muttered to myself, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. "It's not here. It can't be here." But as I turned away from the window, a sound froze me in place. Distant, barely audible over the hum of the hospital's air conditioning, but unmistakable. A low, rumbling growl that sent chills down my spine. I whirled back to the window, my eyes scanning the darkness frantically. There, at the edge of the forest, two glowing eyes, staring directly at me. A scream built in my throat, but before I could release it, the eyes vanished. I stood there, trembling for what felt like hours, but the eyes didn't reappear. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the parking lot, I finally crawled back into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this wasn't over. The creature was out there. It had followed me. And somehow I knew it wouldn't stop until it finished what it had started in that forest. As I lay there, listening to the hospital coming to life around me, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep trying to convince people who were determined not to believe me. I needed to take matters into my own hands. Little did I know, this decision would set me on a path that would change my life forever. The truth was out there, and I was determined to find it, no matter the cost. A year had passed since that fateful night in the Montana wilderness, but the memories remained as vivid as ever. I sat in my new apartment, far from the forests of Montana, staring out the window at the bustling city streets below. The urban landscape was a far cry from the dense woods where my nightmare had unfolded. But even here, surrounded by concrete and steel, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My phone buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. It was Mike, my well-meaning but skeptical friend. I hesitated before answering. "Hey, Sarah." Mike's voice was cautious, as it always was these days. "How are you doing?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm fine, Mike. Same as always." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Listen, a bunch of us are going camping this weekend. I thought maybe, well, it might be good for you to get out. Face your fears, you know." I felt my heart rate spike at the mere mention of camping. "I can't, Mike. You know I can't." "Sarah," Mike's voice was gentle but exasperated. "It's been a year. Don't you think it's time to move on? To stop letting this idea control your life?" I closed my eyes, fighting back the familiar mix of frustration and fear. "It's not an idea, Mike. It was real. I know what I saw, what I experienced." "I know you believe that," he said carefully. "But Sarah, there's never been any evidence. No sightings, no tracks, nothing to support your story. Don't you think it's possible that maybe, just maybe, your mind played tricks on you?" I wanted to scream, to make him understand. But I'd been down this road before, with Mike, with the doctors, with everyone who'd tried to help me move on from my delusion. "I have to go, Mike," I said flatly. "Thanks for the invitation, but I can't go camping. Not now, not ever." I hung up before he could respond, tossing the phone onto the couch. My hands were shaking and I could feel the familiar panic rising in my chest. I moved to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, trying to ground myself in the present. But as I stared out at the city, the urban landscape seemed to blur and shift. For a moment I was back in that forest, the trees looming over me, the sound of heavy footfalls and that bone-chilling roar echoing in my ears. I jerked away from the window, my heart pounding. This was happening more and more lately, these vivid flashbacks that felt so real I could almost smell the pine and damp earth. My eyes fell on the stack of newspapers on my coffee table. I'd been collecting them obsessively, scanning for any reports of strange sightings or unexplained phenomena in wooded areas. So far, there had been nothing concrete, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, someone else had seen what I had seen. I picked up the most recent paper, my eyes skimming the headlines. Suddenly, a small article caught my attention. Hikers report strange noises in Glacier National Park. My hands trembled as I read the article. The hikers described hearing unearthly howls and feeling like they were being watched. It wasn't much, but it was something. A validation, however small, that I wasn't alone in my experience. I reached for my laptop, pulling up the document where I'd been meticulously recording every scrap of information I could find. As I added the new article to my growing collection of evidence, I couldn't help but wonder if I was just feeding my own obsession. A knock at the door made me jump. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was Dr. Emerson, the psychiatrist who had treated me in the hospital and who had been trying to help me process my experience ever since. I hesitated before opening the door. "Dr. Emerson, I wasn't expecting you." She smiled gently. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in. May I come in?" I stepped aside, allowing her into the apartment. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the newspapers, the maps pinned to the walls, the notebooks filled with my scribbled theories and observations. "I see you're still researching," she said carefully. I crossed my arms defensively. "I'm looking for the truth. Someone has to." Dr. Emerson sighed, sitting down on the couch. "Sarah, we've talked about this. This obsession isn't healthy. It's preventing you from moving on with your life." "Moving on?" I laughed bitterly. "How am I supposed to move on when I know what's out there, when I know the danger that exists and no one believes me?" "Sarah," Dr. Emerson's voice was gentle but firm, "we've been over this. There's no evidence to support your belief in this creature. No one else has ever reported seeing anything like what you described." I gestured to the newspapers. "What about these reports? The strange noises, the feelings of being watched?" "Unsubstantiated rumors and the power of suggestion," she replied. "Sarah, you experienced a traumatic event. Your mind is trying to make sense of it, to give it meaning. But sometimes there isn't a deeper meaning. Sometimes terrible things just happen." I turned away, staring out the window at the distant line of trees visible on the horizon. "It's out there," I murmured. "I know it is. And someday, I'll prove it." Dr. Emerson was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with concern. "Sarah, I'm worried about you. This fixation isn't healthy. Have you considered the possibility of inpatient treatment? A chance to really focus on your recovery without all these distractions?" I whirled around, anger flaring. "Inpatient treatment? You mean lock me up in a psych ward? I'm not crazy, Dr. Emerson. I know what I saw." She held up her hands placatingly. "No one's saying you're crazy, Sarah. But you've been through a traumatic experience and it's affecting your ability to function in daily life. I'm just suggesting that maybe a more intensive treatment approach could help." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Emerson, but I'm fine. I'm coping. I need people to believe me." As Dr. Emerson left, promising to check in again soon, I returned to the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. In the fading light, the distant trees seemed to loom larger, more ominous. I pressed my hand against the glass, a shiver running down my spine. "I know you're out there," I whispered, "and someday I'll prove it. To everyone." As night fell, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with memories and theories. I knew that to everyone else I seemed paranoid, obsessed. But how could I explain the terror that gripped me every time I closed my eyes? The certainty that somewhere out there in the dark forests of the world, that creature was still roaming, still hunting. I picked up one of my notebooks, flipping through pages of hastily scribbled notes and rough sketches. My encounter had been unique, yes, but surely I couldn't be the only one. There had to be others out there who had seen what I had seen, who knew the truth. As I stared out at the night sky, a plan began to form in my mind. I couldn't go back to those woods, couldn't face that terror again, but maybe I could find another way to uncover the truth, to make people believe. Little did I know this decision would set me on a path that would change my life forever. The truth was out there, and I was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The sun was dipping below the tree line as our beat-up Jeep Cherokee wound its way deeper into the Washington wilderness. I sat in the passenger seat, my eyes glued to the dense forest passing by in a blur of green and brown. My best friend Sarah was behind the wheel, her excitement palpable as she chattered about our weekend plans. "This is going to be epic, Emily," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. 3 days of nothing but nature, campfires, and ghost stories. No cell phones, no work, no drama. I nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm, but something about the encroaching darkness of the forest made my skin crawl. "Yeah, it'll be great," I replied, my voice lacking conviction. Mike and Jessica, our other 2 friends, were dozing in the back seat, their heads lolling with each bump in the dirt road. We'd been driving for hours, leaving Seattle far behind in pursuit of the perfect, secluded camping spot. As we rounded another bend, the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. An eerie silence fell over the forest, broken only by the crunch of our tires on gravel and the occasional call of a distant bird. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter in my seat. Sarah frowned, slowing the Jeep slightly. "Hear what?" I shook my head, unsure. "I don't know. It was like a low growl or something. Probably just the wind," Sarah shrugged, but I noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. After what felt like an eternity of twisting roads and deepening shadows, we finally arrived at the campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded on all sides by towering pines and thick underbrush. A babbling creek cut through one edge of the site, its gentle sound a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the forest. "This is perfect," Sarah declared, killing the engine. The sudden absence of the car's rumble made the quiet even more pronounced. We piled out of the Jeep, stretching our stiff limbs and breathing in the crisp mountain air. As Mike and Jessica began unloading our gear, I found myself drawn to the edge of the clearing. The dense tree line loomed before me, dark and impenetrable. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if countless unseen eyes were peering out from the shadows. "Hey, Earth to Emily!" Jessica's voice snapped me out of my trance. "Come help us set up the tents, daydreamer." Shaking off my unease, I turned back to my friends and forced a smile. "Sorry, just taking in the scenery." We worked together to set up our 2 tents, laughing and joking as we fumbled with poles and stakes. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Mike got a campfire going, its warm glow creating a small circle of light in the growing darkness. Huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and passing around a bottle of whiskey, the earlier tension began to melt away. Sarah regaled us with her latest dating disaster, while Mike tried to convince us he'd seen a UFO on his last camping trip. "I'm telling you," he insisted, his eyes wide. "It was hovering right over the trees, all lit up like a Christmas tree. Then it just, whoosh, gone in the blink of an eye." Jessica rolled her eyes, playfully shoving his shoulder. "Sure, Mike. And I'm secretly Bigfoot in disguise." We all laughed, but I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. As our laughter died down, I became acutely aware of how hollow it sounded in the vast, silent forest surrounding us. "Speaking of Bigfoot," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "did you guys know this area is supposed to be a hot spot for sightings?" Mike scoffed. "Oh, come on, you don't actually believe in that stuff, do you?" Sarah shrugged, her face eerily illuminated by the flickering firelight. "I'm just saying, there have been a lot of reports around here. Campers hearing strange noises, finding huge footprints, even a few who claim they've seen the creature itself." "What kind of reports?" I found myself asking, leaning in despite my better judgment. Sarah's eyes gleamed as she launched into her tale. "Well, there was this one guy a few years back. He was camping alone, kind of like we are now. In the middle of the night, he heard something huge moving around outside his tent. When he peeked out, he saw this massive, hairy creature rummaging through his cooler. He said it was at least 8 feet tall, with arms as thick as tree trunks. Jessica shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Okay, that's enough Bigfoot stories. You're going to give me nightmares." As if on cue, a twig snapped loudly in the darkness beyond our campfire. We all jumped, nervous laughter quickly following. "It's probably just a deer or something," Mike said, but I noticed him eyeing the tree line warily. We stayed up a while longer, trying to lighten the mood with more jokes and stories, but an undercurrent of unease had settled over our group. As the fire began to die down, we decided to call it a night. Crawling into my sleeping bag next to Sarah, I tried to push away the lingering fear that Sarah's story had stirred up. The nylon walls of the tent suddenly felt paper thin, offering little protection from whatever might be lurking in the forest. "Good night, Emily," Sarah mumbled, already half asleep. "Night," I whispered back, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent. As exhaustion from the long day of travel finally began to overtake me, I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. But even in my dreams, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was out there, watching and waiting. In the deepest part of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My heart pounding, I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There it was again, a heavy footstep, then another, circling our campsite. Whatever was out there, it was big, much bigger than a deer or even a bear. I wanted to wake Sarah to whisper a warning, but fear had paralyzed me. All I could do was lie there, my breath caught in my throat as the footsteps grew closer, then faded away again. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the forest fell silent once more. I remained awake for the rest of the night, my eyes wide open in the darkness, waiting for dawn and trying to convince myself it had all been a product of my overactive imagination. But as the first light of morning began to filter through the tent walls, I knew with a sickening certainty that what I'd heard was real. And somehow, I knew that our peaceful camping trip was about to turn into something far more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees when I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent. I hadn't slept a wink since being jolted awake by those terrifying sounds in the middle of the night. My heart was still racing as I poked my head out, half expecting to come face to face with some monstrous creature. Instead, I was greeted by the peaceful sight of our campsite. Bathed in the soft glow of early morning, birds chirped in the distance and a light mist hung over the ground. For a moment I almost convinced myself that the events of the night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. "Emily?" Sarah's groggy voice came from inside the tent. "What time is it?" I glanced at my watch. "Just after 5:30, I replied, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Sarah groaned. "Why are you up so early? Come back to sleep." I hesitated, debating whether to tell her about what I'd heard, but in the light of day it all seemed so implausible. "I just couldn't sleep," I said finally. "I'm going to take a look around." Stepping out of the tent, I zipped it back up behind me and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The campsite looked undisturbed. Our supplies were still neatly stacked by the extinguished fire pit, and Mike and Jessica's tent was silent. I was about to head back inside when something caught my eye. Near the edge of our campsite, where the clearing met the dense forest, the ground looked different. Frowning, I walked closer, my bare feet sinking into the dew-damp grass. As I approached, my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed deep into the soft mud, was a footprint, but not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of toes and a broad, flat sole. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. "This can't be real." My hands trembling, I pulled out my phone to take a picture, only to remember we had all agreed to leave our phones off for the duration of the trip. Cursing under my breath, I looked around frantically for something to measure the print with. I spotted a fallen branch nearby and grabbed it, laying it across the length of the footprint. The branch, which was about as long as my arm, barely spanned the heel to toe. "Emily?" Mike's voice made me jump. He was standing by his tent, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What are you doing?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I describe what I was seeing without sounding completely insane? I found something," I managed finally. "You need to see this." Mike trudged over, still looking half asleep. But as his eyes fell on the footprint, all traces of drowsiness vanished from his face. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Is that what I think it is?" Before I could respond, a loud crash from the other side of our campsite made us both whirl around. Our food cooler, which we had left securely latched next to the fire pit, was lying on its side, its contents strewn across the ground. "What the hell?" Mike exclaimed, rushing over to inspect the damage. I followed him, my heart pounding. The cooler's plastic lid was warped and cracked, with deep gouges marring its surface. These weren't the marks of a raccoon or even a bear. Whatever had done this had incredible strength. "Guys," Jessica's voice called out as she emerged from her tent. "What's going on?" As Mike explained what we'd found, I knelt down to examine the scattered food. Most of our supplies were ruined, packages torn open, cans crushed and leaking. A horrible, musky odor hung in the air, unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. "This is insane," Jessica said, her voice shaking slightly. "It had to be a bear, right? Maybe we should pack up and leave." Part of me wanted to agree with her, to flee this place and never look back. But another part, the part that had heard those terrifying sounds in the night, knew that what we were dealing with was far more dangerous than a simple bear. "We can't leave yet," I found myself saying. "We need to figure out what's going on here." Mike nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "Emily's right. If there's something dangerous out there, we can't just abandon the campsite for the next group of campers to stumble into." Jessica looked unconvinced, but before she could argue further, Sarah emerged from our tent. "What's all the commotion about?" she asked, then stopped short as she took in the scene before her. "What happened to our food?" As we brought Sarah up to speed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig in the surrounding forest set my nerves on edge. "Okay," Sarah said finally, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a serious frown. "We need a plan. First things first, let's salvage what we can of the food and secure it in the car. Then we'll do a sweep of the campsite perimeter, see if we can find any more signs." We spent the next hour cleaning up the mess and transferring our remaining supplies to the Jeep. As we worked, I filled Sarah in on what I'd heard during the night. To my relief, she didn't dismiss my story outright. "I believe you heard something, Em," she said, her voice low. "But let's not jump to conclusions. There could be a logical explanation for all of this." Once we had secured our campsite as best we could, we set out to explore the surrounding area. We moved in pairs, agreeing to stay within shouting distance of each other. Sarah and I took the eastern edge of the clearing, while Mike and Jessica headed west. As we pushed through the dense underbrush, my senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of danger. Sarah kept up a steady stream of reassuring chatter, but I could tell she was just as unnerved as I was. We had been searching for about 20 minutes when Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing to a nearby tree. "Emily, look!" My eyes followed her gesture and I felt my blood run cold. There, about 7 feet up the trunk, were 3 deep gashes in the bark. They were far too high to have been made by a bear, and the spacing suggested fingers rather than claws. "What could have done that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, a bone-chilling roar echoed through the forest, so loud and close that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. Birds exploded from the treetops in a panic, their frantic cries adding to the cacophony. Sarah and I locked eyes for a split second, terror mirrored in both our faces. Then, as one, we turned and ran back toward the campsite, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. We burst into the clearing just as Mike and Jessica emerged from the opposite side, both looking as terrified as we felt. "Did you hear that?" Mike gasped, his face pale. I nodded, unable to speak as I tried to catch my breath. The roar had faded, but the forest around us had gone deathly quiet, as if every living creature was holding its breath. "We need to get out of here," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "Now." As much as I wanted to agree with her, to jump in the Jeep and speed away from this nightmare, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever was out there in the forest, it was angry, it was powerful, and it was getting closer. "We can't leave yet," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "We need to be prepared. Whatever made that sound, I think it's coming for us." The others looked at me, a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. As the oppressive silence of the forest pressed in around us, I knew that our weekend getaway had turned into a fight for survival, and the worst was yet to come. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. We huddled close to our campsite, jumping at every sound and shadow. As dusk approached, the forest seemed to close in around us, the towering trees taking on sinister shapes in the fading light. "Maybe it's gone," Jessica said hopefully as we gathered around the campfire. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying her fear. "We haven't heard anything since this morning." Mike shook his head, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "I don't think so. It feels like it's waiting for something." I shuddered, knowing he was right. The air felt thick with tension, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "We should take turns keeping watch tonight," Sarah suggested, her usual cheerfulness replaced by grim determination. 2-hour shifts. No one sleeps alone. We all nodded in agreement, too scared to argue. As darkness fell, Mike and Jessica retreated to their tent for the first sleep shift, while Sarah and I positioned ourselves by the fire, our backs to each other as we stared into the impenetrable blackness beyond the firelight. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I found myself straining my eyes, trying to pierce the darkness, sure that at any moment I would see a monstrous shape emerge from the shadows. It was nearing midnight when Sarah nudged me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" I froze, listening intently. At first I heard nothing but the crackling of our fire. Then faintly I caught it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Wake the others," I hissed, scrambling to my feet. Before Sarah could move, a blood-curdling roar shattered the night, so loud and close that it felt like a physical blow. We both stumbled backward, colliding with each other as Mike and Jessica burst out of their tent, eyes wide with terror. "What the hell was that?" Mike shouted, his voice cracking with fear. As if in answer, a massive shape emerged from the tree line, silhouetted against the night sky. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. In the flickering firelight, I caught glimpses of matted fur and gleaming eyes. For a moment, we all stood frozen, unable to comprehend the impossible creature before us. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it charged into our camp. "Run!" I screamed, my paralysis finally breaking. We scattered like leaves in the wind. I sprinted towards the Jeep, my only thought to get the keys and escape. Behind me, I heard Jessica's terrified shriek cut off abruptly, followed by the sickening sound of something heavy hitting the ground. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature had Mike in its grasp, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Mike's screams echoed through the forest before being silenced with a horrifying finality. Bile rose in my throat as I fumbled with the Jeep's door handle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Just as I managed to wrench the door open, a heavy weight slammed into my back, sending me sprawling to the ground. I rolled over, gasping for air, and found myself staring up at the monster. This close I could smell its foul, musky odor, see the saliva dripping from its massive jaws. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. dark, intelligent, and filled with a primal hunger that paralyzed me with fear. Time seemed to slow as the creature reached for me. I could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The matted fur caked with dirt and what looked horribly like dried blood, the long, yellowed claws extending from its massive hands. Just as its fingers were about to close around my throat, a piercing scream cut through the air. Sarah came charging out of nowhere, swinging a burning branch from the campfire like a torch. She brought it down on the creature's arm with all her might. The monster reared back with a roar of pain and fury, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran, plunging blindly into the dark forest. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear the creature's enraged bellows and the sound of trees splintering as it gave chase. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. "This way," Sarah gasped, tugging me to the left. We stumbled down a steep incline, loose rocks and dirt sliding under our feet. I lost my footing and went down hard, tumbling head over heels until I slammed into the trunk of a fallen tree. Dazed and winded, I lay there for a moment, certain that at any second I would feel the creature's claws tearing into me. But the forest had gone eerily quiet. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. There was no response. Panic gripped me as I realized I was alone in the darkness. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself up, using the fallen tree for support. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized I was in some kind of ravine. The steep walls rose up on either side, blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the trees above. I had no idea which direction the campsite was or where Sarah might have gone. A twig snapped somewhere above me, and I instinctively pressed myself against the rough bark of the fallen tree. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Heavy footsteps crunched through the leaf litter, moving slowly, methodically. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. The footsteps paused, and I heard a deep, rumbling sniff. It was scenting the air, trying to locate me. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I remained frozen in place. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. But I didn't dare move, terrified that it might be a trick, that the monster was simply waiting for me to reveal myself. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full horror of what had happened crashed over me. Mike and Jessica were almost certainly dead. Sarah was missing, possibly injured or worse. And I was alone in the dark, hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist. Tears streamed down my face as I huddled in the hollow of the fallen tree. I was exhausted, injured, and more scared than I had ever been in my life. But I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, I would have to move, to try and find help, or at least a way out of this nightmare. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the trees above, I steeled myself for what lay ahead. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the forest, and I had a sickening feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. With trembling hands, I pulled myself out of my hiding spot, every movement causing fresh waves of pain. As I stood on shaky legs, trying to get my bearings, one thought kept repeating in my mind. I had to survive. I had to make it out of this forest and tell someone what had happened, even if no one would believe me. The first rays of dawn were barely piercing through the dense canopy as I stumbled through the forest, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. I had no idea how long I'd been moving, driven by pure survival instinct. My mind was a fog of terror and exhaustion, the events of the night replaying in an endless, horrifying loop. I paused for a moment, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual morning chorus of birds conspicuously absent. It was as if the entire woodland knew there was a predator on the loose. "Sarah," I called out weakly, my voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Sarah, are you out there?" Only silence answered me. I fought back tears, trying to push away the image of Sarah's face as she distracted the creature to save me. Had she managed to escape? Or had the monster? I couldn't bring myself to finish the thought. A twig snapped somewhere behind me and I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. The dense undergrowth revealed nothing, but I could feel eyes on me. Whether animal or something far worse, I couldn't tell. I started moving again, faster this time, no longer caring about the noise I was making. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and whatever was out there as possible. The terrain was becoming steeper, and I realized I was heading uphill. Maybe if I could reach higher ground, I could get my bearings, figure out which way led back to civilization. As I climbed, my lungs burning with each ragged breath, a sound reached my ears that made my blood run cold. It was a low, rumbling growl, unmistakably the same one I'd heard at the campsite. And it was close. Panic surged through me, giving me a fresh burst of energy. I broke into a run, no longer caring about the branches that whipped at my face or the roots that threatened to trip me. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps and the crash of vegetation as something large moved through the forest. I ran blindly through the dark forest, branches whipping my face as I heard the creature crashing behind me. My lungs burned as I sprinted, the sound of heavy breathing and snapping twigs growing ever closer. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Somebody, please help me!" My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, tumbling down a steep slope. Pain exploded through my body as I rolled, unable to stop my descent. When I finally came to a stop, I lay there for a moment, dazed and gasping for air. The sound of pursuit had faded, but I knew I couldn't stay put. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself to my feet. That's when I saw it. A small opening in the rocky hillside. A cave. Without hesitation, I limped towards it. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, it opened up slightly, the darkness absolute. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. For what felt like hours, I stood there, every muscle tense, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the sound of my own thundering heartbeat. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps, slowly circling the area outside the cave. A low, guttural sound reached my ears, a mix between a growl and a sniff. It was scenting the air, trying to locate me. I clapped a hand over my mouth, terrified that even the sound of my breath might give me away. The footsteps came closer, pausing just outside the cave entrance. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its musky animal odor. My legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath me. I knew that if the creature decided to reach into the cave, there would be nowhere for me to go. An eternity seemed to pass. Then, finally, the footsteps began to move away. I remained frozen in place, not daring to move a muscle. Only when the forest had been silent for a long time did I allow myself to slide down the cave wall, my legs finally giving out. As the adrenaline faded, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. My body was a map of cuts, bruises, and what felt like at least one sprained ankle. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and completely lost. "Think, Emily," I whispered to myself, trying to fight off the wave of despair threatening to overwhelm me. "You have to keep it together." I don't know how long I sat there in the darkness, trying to gather my strength and my wits. The cave was cool and damp, and I soon found myself shivering. I knew I couldn't stay here indefinitely, but the thought of venturing back out into the forest where that thing was still hunting filled me with dread. As I sat there, huddled in the darkness, my mind wandered to Sarah, Mike, and Jessica. Were they still out there somewhere, hiding like me? Or had they met a fate too horrible to contemplate? The weight of guilt pressed down on me. I had survived, at least so far, while they... A sob escaped me, echoing slightly in the confines of the cave. I quickly stifled it, terrified that the sound might attract attention. But as I sat there, tears streaming down my face, I realized something. I owed it to my friends to survive, to make it out of this forest and tell people what had happened. Even if no one believed me, I had to try. With that thought, I steeled myself to leave my rocky shelter. I had no idea which direction to go, but I knew I had to keep moving. Staying in one place for too long was just asking to be found. Cautiously, I peeked out of the cave entrance. The forest was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Had I really been in the cave that long? I must have dozed off at some point, my exhausted body finally giving in to sleep. Seeing no immediate signs of danger, I squeezed out of the narrow opening. My muscles protested the movement, stiff from hours of inactivity. I took a moment to stretch, wincing at the various aches and pains that made themselves known. That's when I heard it, the distant sound of running water, a stream or river. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. Water meant a potential source of drinking water, and more importantly, it might lead to civilization. Hikers and campers often followed waterways, and there was a chance it might lead to a road or trail. With renewed determination, I set off in the direction of the sound. My progress was slow, hampered by my injuries and the need to stay alert for any signs of danger. But the promise of potential salvation drove me forward. As I walked, the forest around me began to darken once more. Night was falling, and with it, a fresh wave of terror. I knew the creature was most active after dark. The thought of spending another night in this nightmare forest was almost more than I could bear. Just as I was about to give in to despair, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees, moonlight glinting off water. I had found the stream. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled towards the water's edge. I fell to my knees, cupping my hands to drink greedily. The cool water was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. As I knelt there, catching my breath, a sound reached my ears that made my heart skip a beat. It was distant but unmistakable. The roar of the creature, and it was coming closer. I scrambled to my feet, panic giving me a fresh burst of energy. Without thinking, I plunged into the stream. The shock of the cold water nearly took my breath away, but I pushed forward, half swimming, half wading downstream. The current was stronger than I had anticipated, pulling at my legs and threatening to sweep me off my feet. But I didn't dare leave the water. It was my only hope of throwing the creature off my scent. As I rounded a bend in the stream, I risked a glance over my shoulder. There, on the bank I had just left, stood a massive, dark shape. Even in the dim moonlight, I could make out its hulking form, its eyes gleaming as it scanned the water. Our eyes met for a brief, terrifying moment. Then the current caught me, pulling me around another bend and out of sight. But the image of those intelligent, predatory eyes stayed with me, burning into my memory. I knew the chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. I don't know how long I stayed in that frigid stream, letting the current carry me downstream. My body was numb from the cold, but fear kept me moving. Every shadow on the bank looked like the creature. Every rustle in the trees sent a fresh wave of panic through me. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, I finally dragged myself out of the water. I collapsed on the rocky shore, shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they might break. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I had survived the night. As feeling slowly returned to my limbs, the full extent of my injuries became apparent. My clothes were torn and bloodied, my body a map of cuts, bruises, and what felt like at least one sprained ankle. But it was the emotional toll that weighed heaviest on me. The images of what had happened at the campsite played on an endless loop in my mind. With trembling hands, I pushed myself to my feet. I had to keep moving. I had to find help, to tell someone what had happened. Even if no one believed me, I owed it to my friends to try. I stumbled along the riverbank using trees for support. The forest was waking up around me, birds cautiously beginning their morning songs. It felt surreal, this return to normalcy after the horrors of the night. After what felt like hours of painful progress, I heard a sound that made my heart leap. The distant rumble of a car engine. Civilization. Safety. I changed direction, moving as quickly as my battered body would allow towards the sound. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and found myself on the side of a road. It was little more than a dirt track, but to me it was a lifeline. I collapsed to my knees, overcome with relief. It wasn't long before a pickup truck came around the bend. The driver, an older man in a flannel shirt, slammed on his brakes when he saw me. "Good Lord, miss," he exclaimed, jumping out of the truck. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd been through? Instead, I burst into tears. The man, who introduced himself as Bob, helped me into his truck. He kept asking questions, his voice filled with concern, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just sat there, shaking, as he drove us to the nearest town. The local clinic was small, but the staff reacted quickly when Bob brought me in. I was whisked away to an examination room, where a kind-faced doctor began treating my injuries. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked gently, as she cleaned a particularly nasty cut on my arm. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "My friends," I began, my voice hoarse. "We were camping, and something attacked us. Something big." The doctor's hands paused for a moment. "A bear?" I shook my head. "No, it was bigger. It walked on two legs. I trailed off, seeing the doubt creep into her eyes. "It's okay," she said soothingly. "You're safe now. Let's focus on getting you patched up, all right?" As she worked, a police officer arrived to take my statement. I could see the skepticism on his face as I recounted what had happened, carefully avoiding any mention of Bigfoot or monsters. I stuck to the facts, that we had been attacked, that my friends were missing, that I had fled through the forest. "We'll send out a search party right away," the officer assured me. "But miss, are you sure it wasn't just a bear? The forests around here can play tricks on your mind, especially at night." I wanted to scream, to make them understand the true horror of what I'd witnessed, but I could see in their eyes that they had already made up their minds. To them, I was just a hysterical camper who had gotten lost and injured in the woods. After I was treated and given some fresh clothes, I was taken to the local sheriff's office. They asked me more questions, had me point out on a map where our campsite had been. I could tell they were humoring me, that they didn't really believe my story. "We'll do everything we can to find your friends," the sheriff said, but his tone suggested he didn't expect to find much. As the day wore on, search and rescue teams were dispatched to the area. I wanted to go with them, to show them exactly where everything had happened, but they insisted I stay behind, citing my injuries and the need for rest. So I sat in the sheriff's office, watching the clock tick by, imagining what they might find. Would there be any trace left of Mike and Jessica? Had Sarah managed to survive, like me? Or would the forest have swallowed all evidence of what had occurred, leaving me as the sole, unbelievable witness? As evening approached, the search teams began to return. I could tell from their faces that they hadn't found what they were looking for. "I'm sorry, miss," one of the rangers said, his voice gentle. "We found your campsite, but there was no sign of your friends. No bodies either," he added hesitantly. "What about the footprints?" I asked desperately. "The claw marks on the trees? The destroyed cooler?" The ranger shook his head. "We found some animal tracks, probably a bear. And yeah, your campsite was pretty torn up. Looks like you folks had a run-in with some local wildlife, but there's no evidence of what you described." I felt like I was going to be sick. How was this possible? How could there be no trace of the horror we had experienced? "The storm last night probably washed away a lot of evidence," another ranger chimed in, trying to be helpful. "We'll keep searching, of course, but..." His voice faded into background noise as the reality of my situation sank in. No one believed me. There was no proof of what had happened. No evidence of the creature that had destroyed my friends and nearly killed me. To the world, it would be just another tragic camping accident, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness. As night fell once again, I found myself in a small motel room on the outskirts of town. The sheriff had advised me to stay local in case they needed to ask more questions, but I knew it was really because they weren't sure what to do with me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the dark line of trees in the distance, Somewhere out there, the creature was still roaming free. Would anyone ever believe me? Would I ever be able to prove what had really happened? A chill ran down my spine as a sudden thought struck me. What if it wasn't over? What if the creature, having gotten a taste for human prey, decided to venture closer to town? What if I had only escaped its forest domain, not its hunt? I got up and double-checked the lock on the door, then closed the curtains tight. As I lay down on the bed, every creak of the old motel, every rustle of wind outside made me flinch. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with nightmares of glowing eyes in the darkness and the echoes of my friends' screams. And through it all, a gnawing certainty that my ordeal wasn't truly over. That somehow, someway, I would have to face that creature again. Because if I didn't, if I couldn't prove what had happened, then Mike, Jessica, and Sarah would have died for nothing. And that was a thought more terrifying than any monster lurking in the woods. The harsh fluorescent lights of the sheriff's office made my eyes ache as I sat in the hard plastic chair, waiting. I'd barely slept in the motel, plagued by nightmares and the constant fear that the creature might somehow find me. Now, as morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, I was back here, ready to give my official statement. Deputy Johnson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a skeptical frown, sat across from me, a notepad in hand. "All right, Miss Carson," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's go through this one more time. Start from the beginning." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon," I began, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "It was me, Sarah, Mike, and Jessica. Everything was fine at first. We set up camp, had dinner, told stories around the fire." The deputy nodded, jotting down notes. "And when did things start to change?" I closed my eyes, the memories flooding back with vivid clarity. "It was in the middle of the night. I woke up to sounds, heavy footsteps circling our campsite." "Could it have been a bear?" Deputy Johnson interjected, his pen poised over the paper. I shook my head vehemently. "No, it wasn't a bear. It was walking on two legs, and the sounds it made, they weren't like any animal I've ever heard." The deputy's frown deepened, but he gestured for me to continue. "In the morning, we found footprints. Huge footprints, bigger than any humans. And our food supplies were destroyed, the cooler torn apart like it was made of paper." "Miss Carson," Deputy Johnson said, his tone careful, "you understand that bears are capable of causing significant damage to camping equipment, right?" I felt a flare of frustration. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "What we saw, what attacked us, it was huge, at least 8 feet tall. It walked on two legs, had long arms, was covered in fur. It took Mike. I saw it grab him, heard him scream." My voice broke and I had to pause, fighting back tears. The deputy waited patiently, his expression a mix of sympathy and doubt. "I know how this sounds," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know you think I'm crazy or lying or traumatized, but I'm telling you the truth. Something is out there in those woods, something dangerous. And my friends, they're still out there." Deputy Johnson sighed, setting down his pen. "Emily," he said, using my first name for the first time, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, and we are taking your report seriously. We have search teams combing the area as we speak, but you have to understand what you're describing. It's hard to believe." "I know," I said, feeling defeated, "but it's the truth. Every word of it." The deputy nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. "We'll keep searching for your friends," he assured me, "and we'll investigate every lead. But right now, the evidence we've found points to a bear attack. The storms washed away a lot of potential evidence, but what we did find, the destroyed campsite, some large animal tracks, it all fits with a bear encounter." I wanted to scream, to make him understand that what we'd faced was far worse than any bear. But I could see it was useless. In his mind, and in the minds of everyone else in this town, I was just a traumatized girl who'd had a scary encounter in the woods and let her imagination run wild. "Is there anything else you can tell us?" Deputy Johnson asked. "Anything that might help us locate your friends?" I shook my head, feeling utterly helpless. "I've told you everything I know, everything I saw." The deputy nodded, closing his notepad. "All right, Miss Carson. We'll be in touch if we need any more information. In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. There's a victim support counselor available if you'd like to talk to someone." I stood up, my legs feeling weak. "Thank you," I mumbled, not knowing what else to say. As I turned to leave, Deputy Johnson spoke again. "Emily," he said, his voice softer now. "I know this is hard, but try to remember, sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're scared. What seems monstrous in the dark of night often looks different in the light of day." I didn't respond. How could I explain that what I'd seen was far more terrifying in the harsh light of day than it had been in the darkness of the forest? Stepping out of the sheriff's office, I blinked in the bright sunlight. The town bustled around me, people going about their daily lives, oblivious to the horror that lurked in the nearby woods. For a moment, I envied them their ignorance. I made my way back to the motel, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? No one believed me. There was no evidence to support my story. And somewhere out there, that creature was still roaming free, while my friends... I couldn't bear to finish that thought. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. The girl looking back at me was a stranger, pale with dark circles under her eyes and a haunted look that I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed, making me jump. It was a text from my mom, asking if I was okay, if I needed her to come get me. I hadn't told her the full story yet, just that there had been an accident while camping and that my friends were missing. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, not when I knew she wouldn't believe me either. As I sat there, trying to figure out what to do next, a news alert popped up on my phone. My heart nearly stopped as I read the headline, "Missing hikers found dead in National Forest. Animal attack suspected." With shaking hands, I opened the article. It wasn't about my friends. This had happened in a different state months ago. But as I read, my blood ran cold. The details were eerily similar to what we had experienced. A group of hikers attacked in the night, their campsite destroyed, only one survivor who told a wild tale of a monstrous creature. And just like me, no one had believed them. I scrolled through more articles, my mind racing. There were others. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. Scattered across the country, over many years, stories of campers and hikers encountering something in the woods that defied explanation. Most were dismissed as bear attacks or hoaxes, but the similarities were undeniable. For the first time since my escape from the forest, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't alone. There were others out there who had seen what I had seen, who knew the truth. But with that hope came a chilling realization. If these stories were true, if what I had encountered wasn't unique, then the danger was far greater than anyone realized. This wasn't just about me and my friends anymore. It was about exposing a threat that had been lurking in the shadows for who knows how long. I looked out the window at the line of trees in the distance, feeling a mix of fear and determination. I knew then that I couldn't just walk away from this, couldn't pretend it never happened. Somehow, some way, I had to find proof. I had to make people believe. Because if I didn't, how many more would fall victim to the monster in the woods? With renewed purpose, I turned back to my phone, ready to dig deeper into these other incidents. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but I knew one thing for certain. My ordeal was far from over. It was only just beginning. The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I heard a knock at my motel room door. My heart leapt into my throat, memories of the creature's heavy footsteps flooding back. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. To my relief, it was Deputy Johnson. I opened the door, trying to calm my racing pulse. "Miss Carson," he said, his face grave. We're organizing a search party to go back into the forest. I thought you might want to join us. I hesitated. The thought of going back into those woods filled me with dread, but I knew I had to. For my friends. For the truth. I'll come, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. An hour later, I found myself in the back of a police SUV, heading towards the forest that had nearly claimed my life. The search party consisted of local law enforcement, forest rangers, and a few volunteers from town. Their faces were grim but determined. As we neared the forest's edge, I felt my chest tighten. The trees loomed before us, dark and foreboding. I closed my eyes, taking deep breaths to stave off panic. "You okay back there?" Deputy Johnson asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We parked at a trailhead and the group gathered to receive instructions. I stood slightly apart, my eyes scanning the tree line. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. "All right, folks," the lead ranger addressed the group. "We're looking for any signs of the missing campers or their equipment. Stay in your assigned teams, maintain radio contact, and if you see anything unusual, do not approach. Call it in immediately." As the teams began to disperse, Deputy Johnson approached me. "You'll be with me and Ranger Davis," he said, gesturing to a tall woman in a Forest Service uniform. "Just point us in the direction of your campsite." We set off into the forest, the familiar scents of pine and damp earth bringing back a flood of memories. I led the way, retracing the path we'd taken just days ago. Had it really only been days? It felt like a lifetime. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig, every bird call set my nerves on edge. Deputy Johnson and Ranger Davis kept throwing concerned glances my way, but I ignored them, pressing on. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a clearing that made my blood run cold. "This is it," I whispered. This was our campsite. But the scene before us bore little resemblance to the site of carnage I'd fled. The ground was muddy from recent rains, obscuring any tracks. Our tents were gone, likely washed away by the storm. There were some scattered remnants of our supplies, but nothing to suggest the violent attack I'd witnessed. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Ranger Davis asked, her voice gentle but skeptical. I nodded, moving further into the clearing. "Our tents were here," I said, pointing. "And the cooler, the one that was destroyed. It was over there." Deputy Johnson knelt down, examining the ground. "There are some disturbed areas here," he said. "Could be consistent with a large animal. Bear, maybe." I bit back a frustrated cry. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "I told you, it was—" My words were cut off by a crackling sound from the ranger's radio. "Team 2 to base. We found something." We all froze, listening intently. "Go ahead, Team 2, the ranger responded. "We've located some torn clothing about a half-mile north of the campsite. Looks like it could belong to one of the missing campers." My heart raced. "That's got to be from one of my friends," I said. "We need to go there." Deputy Johnson nodded, already moving. "Lead the way, Ranger Davis." We set off at a brisk pace, pushing through dense underbrush. As we neared the location, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. Something felt wrong. We broke through into another small clearing, where 2 other search team members were crouched over something on the ground. As we approached, I saw a torn piece of fabric that I recognized with a jolt. It was from Mike's favorite flannel shirt. "Oh, God," I whispered, feeling lightheaded. Deputy Johnson put a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Easy now," he said softly. As the others discussed the find, I found my gaze drawn to the surrounding trees. That's when I saw it. 3 deep gashes in the bark of a nearby pine, about 7 feet off the ground. My breath caught in my throat. "Look," I said, pointing. "Those marks. That's what I was telling you about." The group gathered around the tree, examining the marks. "Could be from a bear," one of the rangers suggested. "They sometimes claw trees to mark their territory." I shook my head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. These are too high for a bear. And look at the spacing, it's like fingers, not claws." I could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances. They still didn't believe me. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, causing us all to jump. It was distant, but unmistakably human. "That came from the north," Ranger Davis said, already reaching for her radio. "All teams converge on Sector 7. We have a possible survivor." As the group mobilized, moving quickly through the trees, I felt a mix of hope and terror. Could one of my friends have survived? Or was this another trick of the forest? We pushed on, the sound of breaking branches and heavy breathing filling the air. I lagged slightly behind, my injuries from the previous nights still slowing me down. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. I froze, my eyes darting around wildly. "Did you hear that?" I called out to the others, but they were too far ahead, their voices fading into the distance. Another growl, closer this time, and then from the corner of my eye I saw movement, a massive, dark shape slipping between the trees. Terror gripped me. It was here. The creature had found us. I opened my mouth to scream, to warn the others, but no sound came out. My legs felt like lead, refusing to move. The shape moved again, circling around behind me. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its musky odor. This was it. After everything I'd been through, after surviving that terrible night, it had found me again. And this time, there was nowhere to run. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, staring into the shadows where I knew the creature lurked, one thought echoed through my mind. No one would ever believe what had happened here. No one would ever know the truth. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath, and in that moment of terrifying stillness, I knew that my nightmare was far from over. It was about to begin anew. The world seemed to spin around me as I sat in the back of the ambulance, a scratchy blanket draped over my shoulders. The flashing lights of police cars and emergency vehicles cast an eerie glow on the trees at the forest's edge. I couldn't stop shaking, my mind replaying the horrors I'd just experienced. "Miss Carson?" A gentle voice broke through my daze. I looked up to see a paramedic watching me with concern. "Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere?" I shook my head, then winced as the movement sent a sharp pain through my temple. I don't know," I mumbled. The paramedic nodded sympathetically and began checking me over. As she worked, I caught snippets of conversation from the cluster of officers and rangers nearby. No sign of the others. Tracks washed away by the rain. Could have been a bear, but I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand that what we'd encountered was no bear. But the words caught in my throat, replaced by a choked sob. Deputy Johnson approached, his face etched with a mix of concern and bewilderment. "Emily," he said softly, crouching down to my eye level. "Can you tell us what happened out there?" I took a shuddering breath, trying to organize my thoughts. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? We heard a scream," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone ran towards it, but I fell behind and then I saw it again." The deputy's brow furrowed. "Saw what, Emily?" "The creature," I said, my voice breaking. "The same one from before. It was huge, covered in fur. It moved so fast." I could see the doubt creeping into Deputy Johnson's eyes, but he pressed on. "What happened next?" I closed my eyes, the memories flooding back with vivid clarity. It charged at me. I ran, but it was so close. I could hear it breathing, smell its musk. I thought for sure it had me, but then I trailed off, remembering the deafening crack of gunfire that had split the air, the creature's roar of pain, the thundering of its retreat through the underbrush. "That's when Ranger Davis found me," I finished lamely. Deputy Johnson nodded slowly. "Emily, Ranger Davis says she fired her weapon at a large animal that was charging towards you. She believes it was a bear." I shook my head vehemently, ignoring the pain the movement caused. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "I know what I saw. It was the same creature that attacked our camp. The same one that took my friends. The deputy sighed, standing up. We're going to keep searching for your friends, Emily. But right now, we need to get you to a hospital to get checked out. As if on cue, the paramedic returned. We're ready to transport her now, she told the deputy. I wanted to protest, to demand they keep searching, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking me. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught one last glimpse of the dark forest looming in the distance. Somewhere in those woods, the creature was still out there. And my friends. The hospital was a blur of bright lights, concerned faces, and endless questions. X-rays, CT scans, blood tests. They ran every test imaginable, searching for an explanation for my story that didn't involve mythical monsters. Well, Miss Carson, the doctor said, flipping through my chart. Physically, you're in remarkably good shape considering what you've been through. Some cuts and bruises, mild dehydration, and a slight concussion, but nothing life-threatening. I nodded numbly, barely registering his words. However, he continued, his tone growing more serious, I am concerned about the psychological impact of your ordeal. It's not uncommon for survivors of traumatic events to experience altered perceptions of reality. I felt a flare of anger. You think I'm crazy, I said flatly. The doctor's expression softened. Not at all. I think you've been through a terrifying experience and your mind is trying to make sense of it. But sometimes in high-stress situations, our brains can play tricks on us. I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but I was so tired. So instead, I just nodded again. I'm recommending you speak with our trauma counselor, the doctor continued. And I think it might be best if you stay here overnight for observation. As night fell, I found myself alone in a sterile hospital room, staring out the window at the distant line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves outside made me flinch. A soft knock at the door startled me. A nurse entered, carrying a tray with some food and a small paper cup with pills. How are you feeling, dear? She asked kindly. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. She set the tray down and handed me the cup of pills. These will help you sleep, she explained. I took them without argument, desperate for any respite from the constant fear and replaying memories. As the nurse left, I picked at the bland hospital food, my mind racing. How could I make them understand what I'd seen? How could I prove that the creature was real when there was no evidence left behind? My gaze drifted back to the window, to the dark forest beyond. The medication was starting to take effect, making my eyelids heavy. But as I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if it wasn't over? What if the creature, having gotten a taste for human prey, decided to venture closer to town? What if I had only escaped its forest domain, not its hunt? My dreams were a chaotic mix of memories and fears. I saw my friends, their faces twisted in terror as they were dragged into the darkness. I heard the creature's bone-chilling roar, felt its hot breath on the back of my neck as I ran through an endless forest, and through it all, a gnawing certainty that my ordeal wasn't truly over, that somehow, someway I would have to face that creature again, because if I didn't, if I couldn't prove what had happened, then Mike, Jessica, and Sarah would have died for nothing. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across my hospital room, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to make them believe. I would find proof of the creature's existence. And I would make sure that no one else ever had to experience the terror I had faced in those dark woods. Little did I know, my nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. The morning light filtered through the hospital room window, casting long shadows across the sterile white floor. I sat on the edge of the bed, my legs dangling as I stared at the small TV mounted on the wall. The local news was on, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw the familiar tree line of the forest where our nightmare had unfolded. In local news, the search continues for 3 missing campers in the Cascade Mountains. The anchor's voice droned, Emily Carson, the sole survivor of what authorities are calling a tragic camping accident, claims the group was attacked by an unidentified creature. However, forest rangers suspect a bear may be responsible. I felt a surge of frustration and anger. How could they dismiss what happened so easily? The remote control clattered to the floor as I hurled it at the TV, causing a nurse to poke her head in with a concerned look. "Everything okay in here, Miss Carson?" she asked cautiously. I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Sorry, just frustrated." She gave me a sympathetic look before leaving, closing the door softly behind her. I turned back to the TV, where they were now showing file footage of bear attacks in the region. That's when something caught my eye. In the corner of the screen, barely visible, was a blurry shape moving between the trees. It was only there for a split second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The shape was tall, bipedal, and definitely not a bear. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking as I rewound the news segment and paused on that frame. It wasn't much, just a dark smudge really, but I knew what I was looking at. It was the creature. It had to be. A knock at the door made me jump. Deputy Johnson entered, his face grim. "Emily," he said, taking a seat next to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, my mind racing. Should I tell him about what I'd seen on the news? Would he even believe me? Any news about my friends? The deputy sighed, removing his hat. "I'm afraid not. We've expanded the search area, but, well, it's been almost 48 hours now. We're starting to lose hope of finding them alive." I felt a lump form in my throat. "You have to keep looking," I pleaded. "They could still be out there." Deputy Johnson nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Emily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything else you remember about that night? Anything at all that might help us understand what happened?" I hesitated, my finger hovering over the play button on my phone. This was my chance to show him the evidence, to make him understand that what I saw was real. But as I looked at his face, saw the mixture of concern and skepticism, I realized it wouldn't be enough. A blurry shape on a TV screen wouldn't convince anyone. "No," I said finally, lowering my phone. "I've told you everything I remember." The deputy nodded, standing up. "All right. Well, if you think of anything else, no matter how small or strange it might seem, please let us know. We're doing everything we can to find your friends." As he left, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I should have shown him the video, should have tried to make him understand. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have made a difference. They had already made up their minds about what happened. I turned back to my phone, determined to find more evidence. If that news footage had captured the creature even for a moment, there had to be other sightings out there. Hours passed as I scoured the internet, searching for any reports of similar incidents. Most of what I found was clearly hoaxes or misidentified bears, but there were a few accounts that made my skin crawl. Stories of hikers gone missing, of campers hearing strange noises in the night, of massive unexplained footprints found in remote areas. One report in particular caught my attention. It was from a small town in Oregon, not far from where we had been camping. A hiker had gone missing 2 months ago, and the only clue left behind was a torn backpack and a blurry photo on their camera. My hands shook as I zoomed in on the image. There, half hidden behind a tree, was a dark shape that looked chillingly familiar. The same broad shoulders, the same long arms, the same sense of raw, primal power that I had seen in the forest. "It's real," I whispered to myself, a mix of vindication and terror washing over me. "It's all real." Just then, my phone buzzed with a news alert. My heart nearly stopped as I read the headline. "Breaking news. Another hiker missing in Cascade Mountains." I clicked on the article, my eyes racing over the words. A solo hiker had failed to return from a day trip, and search and rescue teams were being mobilized. The location was less than 10 miles from where we had been attacked. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. It was happening again. The creature was still out there, still hunting. I looked out the window at the distant line of trees, my mind racing. I couldn't just sit here in this hospital bed while more people were in danger. I had to do something, had to find a way to prove what was really happening in those woods. But how? No one believed me. I had no concrete evidence, no way to prove that what I'd seen was real. And even if I did, who would listen to me? I was just a traumatized survivor, my credibility already questioned by those who were supposed to help. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my room, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get back out there, had to find some way to expose the truth. I knew it was crazy. I knew it was dangerous. But I also knew that if I didn't do something, more people would die. My friends' deaths would be in vain. With shaking hands, I began to gather my things, my mind already formulating a plan. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to go back to the forest. As I prepared to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I could almost feel the creature's presence, as if it was waiting for me, calling me back to finish what had started in those dark woods. This time, I vowed, things would be different. This time, I would be ready. Little did I know. The true horror of what awaited me in those mountains was beyond anything I could have imagined. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out of the hospital, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. I knew what I was about to do was reckless, possibly even suicidal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had no other choice. The creature was still out there, and no one else seemed to understand the true danger it posed. I hailed a taxi, giving the driver an address near the forest's edge. As we drove through the quiet town, I couldn't help but feel like I was seeing it all for the last time. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a weak smile. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just had a rough couple of days." He nodded sympathetically. "I heard about those missing campers on the news. Terrible business. You be careful out there, you hear?" If only he knew. As we neared the forest, I felt my resolve wavering. What was I thinking? Going back there? But then I remembered the faces of my friends, the terror in their eyes as the creature attacked. I had to do this. For them. The taxi dropped me off at a small convenience store near the trailhead. I spent the last of my cash on a flashlight, some energy bars, and a disposable camera. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As I approached the forest's edge, the trees loomed before me, dark and foreboding. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward. I had to find proof, had to make people believe. The trail was eerily quiet as I made my way deeper into the woods. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it. This was where we had made camp that fateful night. The area looked different now, the ground muddy and churned up from the search parties. But I could still see it in my mind's eye. Our tents, the campfire, my friends laughing and telling stories. I shook off the memories, focusing on the task at hand. I began setting up the camera traps I had bought, positioning them carefully around the clearing. If the creature returned here, I would have proof. As I worked, a twig snapped loudly in the darkness beyond the clearing. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. For a moment I thought I saw movement, a large dark shape slipping between the trunks. But when I blinked, it was gone. My hand shook as I finished setting up the last camera. The forest seemed to press in around me, the darkness almost palpable. I knew I should leave, should get out while I still could. But something kept me rooted to the spot. That's when I smelled it. A musky animal odor that made my blood run cold. It was the same scent I had detected just before the creature attacked our camp. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I slowly turned in a circle, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to shift and move, shadows taking on monstrous shapes. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a pair of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, glowing an eerie yellow in the darkness. But as I watched, frozen in terror, a massive shape emerged from the tree line. It was just as I remembered, impossibly tall, with long, powerful arms and a body covered in thick, matted fur. But it was the face that truly terrified me. Those eyes, so intelligent and yet so alien, fixed on me with a predatory intensity that made my blood run cold. For a moment, we just stared at each other, human and monster, separated by mere yards of moonlit clearing. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it charged. I turned and ran, blind panic giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls growing closer with each passing second. My lungs burned as I sprinted, the sound of my own ragged breathing almost drowning out the creature's pursuit. But I could still hear it, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that desperate flight through the dark forest. But eventually I saw something ahead, a break in the trees, moonlight glinting off what looked like a paved surface. With a final burst of speed, I broke through the tree line and onto a road. I could see headlights approaching in the distance, and I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car, a police cruiser, screeched to a halt beside me. Deputy Johnson leapt out, his hand on his holster. "Emily?" he exclaimed, shock evident in his voice. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I turned back towards the forest, ready to point out the creature that I knew must be right behind me. But there was nothing there. Just the dark line of trees, silent and still in the moonlight. I saw it again," I gasped, my voice shaking. The creature, it chased me. It was right there. Deputy Johnson's face softened with pity. "Emily, there's nothing there. Come on, let's get you back to the hospital." As he led me to the car, I couldn't stop looking back at the forest. Had I imagined it all? No, I was sure I hadn't. The terror had been too real, the chase too vivid. But as we drove away, the forest receding in the rearview mirror, I realized with a sinking feeling that once again I had no proof, no evidence to support my wild tale. All I had were my memories, my fear, and the unshakable certainty that somewhere in those dark woods, a monster was watching and waiting. As we sped down the mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For just a moment I thought I saw a massive shadowy figure at the tree line, watching our car disappear into the night. I blinked, and it was gone. But the memory of those glowing eyes, that primal hunger, would stay with me forever. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and someday, somehow, our paths would cross again.